I titled the presentation as Doom, and let me briefly talk about my presentation first. Herman Melville set out for the Pacific, hoping for ease, pleasure, and relief for the demands of American life. But though he found what he went looking for, the people there struck him as deeply odd rather than compatible and familiar. So their peculiarity excited fear, but interest as well, and interest that prompted speculative curiosity concerning the constitutive patterns of their culture. Rather than a mirrored reverse of life in the United States, Melville came upon an independent social whole equipped with unanticipated resources. So in this presentation, I will argue that his memory of this discovery may have asserted itself during the composition of Moby Dick. Since much of what I will contend is speculative, though, but I hope you listeners will agree to consider yourselves as to entertain a possibility rather than to swallow a fact. So I start with a quote of D.H. Lawrence. Melville correlates Blackness, interracial encounters, and cognitive disruptions across his writings. Thus, he's numbered among the most important writers of the American Renaissance era. The focus in the study comes from actually the notion that powerful whites throughout the Americas used racial difference as a method through which to manage power, knowledge over enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and of course, Pacific Islanders. So what Melville constantly highlights through his depictions of encounters between the races in Moby Dick, that is how characters' notions of white imperious supremacy is defined by the notions of what is possible for human beings to know and conquer. So the study actually tried to explore how Melville attacks his white protagonists who desire knowledge, confirmation, and power, and with psychic and also physical disturbances that turn into continuing feelings of powerlessness and suffering. That's why in these traumatic changes and disturbances, Melville brings in that D.H. Lawrence referred to as doom, doom, doom. So Melville's representation of Blackness just do not oppose U.S. colonial supremacy or the absolute power of slave management. It also asks subjects to imagine themselves in uncertainty where all sociopolitical roots disappear. And Melville reimages also and reimagines the various types of social engagement in different geographies in the book, turning the deck of Pequot, for example, in Moby Dick, into zones of contact. So I'd like also, Melville repeatedly emphasizes throughout his depictions of encounters between the races as how subjects' notions of white imperial supremacy is defined by broader notions of what is possible for human beings to discover and conquer that I mentioned, aforementioned. Richard Slotkin, a cultural critic and an historian, that I read his book while I was reading for the second time reading Melville. He presents the idea that he claims interracial conflicts under colonialism are significant moments when whites confirm their cultural and political sense of themselves. So this study, however, questions actually how Melville strikes his white protagonists who must desire knowledge, confirmation, power with psychic and physical disruptions. That turn into lasting and sustained feelings of paralysis and suffering, which is so forceful to that there's no way to recover it. That's why I quoted from D.H. Lawrence article with referring to that he refers to Melville's Moby Dick. So the link between literature and psychoanalysis has long been admitted as intertextual. So they both mutually inform cultural and historical practices and explore the complexity of the human unconscious and the ways in which it seeks representation. So the approaching a literary text psychoanalytically will reveal to us things about the relation between the mind, language, and reality, which stay hidden under the surface of the text. So which was, I had, of course, difficulty with the psychoanalytic interpretation, though it's not my major. But psychoanalytic interpretation aims at describing mental operations in linguistic terms. So describing literary dynamics in psychoanalytical terms. On the other hand, also this study focused on the way that subjectivity is shaped by representations and on the divisions of personality against itself. So when we consider Moby Dick as something postmodern fiction, which is based, first of all, on the post-structural treatment of the relationship of objectivity and subjectivity and the language application. So the point here is that according to Derrida, all notions of the existence of an absolute meaning in language are wrong. So Melville himself opens a way to deconstruct the story of an old sea captain crazed by the loss of his leg, chasing a white whale around the world to wreak his revenge on it. And the subject matter thus formulated levels of deconstruction we can claim, which is madness, body mutilation, and revenge, of course. So these three levels constitute the human existence of reference. It confronts the non-human existence of reference, the transcendental, the white whale. Both the human and non-human may refer to psychoanalytic assumptions, for sure. So first, we might focus on the white whale image, though time is so short to talk about it. Okay, Moby Dick is often viewed as a symbol in the traditional transcendental association in its nature's power. And psychoanalytically, it's the first of all Jungian psychic Jonah the whale complex. The term is the reshaping of the Freudian Oedipus complex. So Adams explains, quote, in Jung's theory of Jonah the whale complex, incest is interpreted metaphorically as a symbol of transformation. Jonah's whale is a symbol of the mother, not the child's real mother, but the very idea of the mother. The first child experiences the mother not as a personal fact, but as transpersonal fantasy or archetype that evokes an indefinite number of meanings in the child's imagination. The archetype, however, has two aspects: the good mother, and who aids the child in transformation of this personality, of his personality, and the terrible mother, who hinders his development. So in Jung's Jonah the whale complex, both aspects assume the symbolic form of a fish. A fish in Jungian psychoanalysis, it's interwoven into sign reading, symbol interpretation. Simultaneously, it's the astrological sign of Pisces, if you're interested in science. So the two fishes in opposition. According to Jung, one of them symbolizes the child, the other the terrible mother who swallows. So in Ahab's case, for example, this parallelism is found in the amplification of Moby Dick's image, and also in the fact that Ahab anticipates a confrontation with Moby Dick at the equinox, when the equator interests the ecliptic, and then the sun is in the Pisces at that point, which is which is also a sign of doom, actually. And Ahab is hindered from his development by the subconscious image of the terrible mother. The metaphoric eating up Jonah the whale perfectly transfers to the actual ending up of Ahab's leg by Moby Dick. The good mother in the image of Jonah emerging from the whale's mouth never comes into in the novel to reach the equilibrium to cure Ahab, for example. But some questions still remain. We can ask, why doesn't Melville concentrate on Ahab's human relationships that might be crucial to the understanding of this complex? Or is it only Jonah the whale complex that explains the novel? Of course not. So some light on the problem of the whale was thrown actually by D.H. Lawrence, and in his studies in classics American literature, studies in classic American literature, he pities Moby Dick being hunted. In Lawrence's view, the book is really the voyage of the soul, and Lawrence interprets Moby Dick as a soul. Quote, this animal, as Lawrence observes, quote, is warm-blooded and lovable, unquote. So Lawrence then tries to explain why a harmless Leviathan is so pursued violently, leaving out the commercial aspect. Lawrence assumes the South Sea Islanders, Polynesians, Malays, they worshipped shark, crocodile, but never a white whale, a whale. Specifically, he's not wicked, he doesn't bite, and their gods had to bite. So it's an observation. A vicious animal is worshipped because it's dangerous, but a harmless one, which causes the desire to possess and to exercise power. And there's something really overwhelming in these whale hunts, almost superhuman or inhuman, bigger than life. And so it happens, a man hunts down his own innocent soul. He pursues his deepest blood nature because he's unwilling to recognize his deeper self. What then is Moby Dick? Lawrence asks. He's the deepest blood being of the white race. He's our deepest blood nature. So these two radically, extremely different conclusions that the meaning of the white whale image as the non-human existence of reference work as representations of subjectivity. Subjectivity in both interpretations has a realistic object image form and also subconscious content. So when we come to Jung, he concentrates on the archetypal. Lawrence actually, on the other hand, he stresses the racial, thus attributing a certain degree to universality of the symbol. So when we approach the text from Jungian concepts, we have to assume together that with Jung, a missing leg is just a missing leg. The object means what it means. So the task is, we need to ask what the purpose is. That's Jung's amplification of images, or a kind of a comparative method that attempts to identify parallels, establishes what is archetypal about the image. So we might consider, let us consider what object or persona do we associate with evil. As I aforementioned and quoted on the previous slides, M.V. Adams, he notes a peculiarity of the devil's image. Quote, he says, the archetype of the shadow is closely related to the archetype of the demon. So the shadow archetype provides an explanation actually for Ahab's attraction and fascination with evil. So the shadow archetype, as Jung says, is the individual's dark or evil side, which is repressed, denied, and projected just like a shadow onto others. And Melville compares the devil-looking crew to shadows. That's where he gives embodiment to the image. It's unequal in Melville's case when we project the protagonist disembodiment or the pursuit of some mystic image, the shadow. It represents repression. So we can conclude that Ahab's dark and evil nature, or the devil of the man, project itself on the image of the whale. So Jung, when we go further on, Jung states, quote, this figure demon often appears as dark skin and of mongoloid type, and then it represents a negative and possibly dangerous aspect. Mongoloid type is just thinking about himself, stuck on one thing. So it represents a negative and possibly dangerous aspect. Sometimes it can be hardly distinguished, if at all, from the shadow, unquote. So in collective unconscious, according to Jung, it's the unconscious of the Occidental, of the archetype of the demon, quite frequently appears as a figure in the novel, with the figures of an Oriental, actually. Okay. Okay, Moby Dick is a white whale. The captain is white-skinned. And in Ahab's case, the projection of an evil on the white whale as a different and non-racial basis. This is with bodily harm caused by the whale. Yet Ishmael confesses, quote, "It was the whiteness of the whale that above all things appealed me," unquote. So Ishmael here confesses it was the whiteness of the whale. So Mabel offers through Ishmael, that eye of the book, an extended reflection of the spotless chastity of white color. But then he also admits that, quote, not even in our superstitions do we fail to throw the same snowy mantle round our phantoms, all ghosts rising in a milk-white fog, unquote. So remembering Lawrence's view of Moby Dick as a white soul man, we can as well assume that this is a conflict in Ahab's soul. Both are miraculously represented by the whale. Quote, therefore, in his other moods, symbolize whatever grants or gracious thing he will by whiteness, no man can deny that in its profoundest idealized significance, it calls up a peculiar apparition to the soul, unquote. So what Lawrence states about the outcome was the word doom of our white day, and Melville knew his race was doomed, his white soul doomed, okay, unquote. And thus, while critics argue that Melville's portrayals of racial conflict renew the possibilities of political speech, expose problematic, uneasy attempts for racial empathy, or it unveils flashes of Black rebellion and freedom, this study actually brought out what criticism fails to notice. Most of the critics, actually, most of them noticed, but most of the critics unnoticed. Through social encounters marked by racial difference, Melville permeates the concrete life of transatlantic slavery and colonialism with a sense of existential suffering and irreconcilable confusion. So whether they focus on Blackness or race politically, philosophically, or both, so they most of the critics I searched for, they mostly attempt to show how subjects relate to ontological problems, like the inevitable facts or death, unpredictable violence of nature, or unavoidable notions of others. So Blackness mispronounced, actually. So I also want to have a quote from Houston Baker, because Houston Baker, a social historian, he restored Blackness to a sign that Blackness is the establishment unhappy and unsettled. So he says that Blackness must be analyzed at the intersection of the philosophical and the social in order to show how interracial encounters challenge philosophical ideals of self-mastery and mastery over others, as well as Melville's broader meditations on knowledge and power, which are inconveniently married to racial difference. So in Moby Dick, two protagonists, Ishmael and Ahab, they perceive versions of ideal mastership that reflects the pursuit of power and knowledge on the imperial frontier. The characters are plagued by shadows, vapors, and even more explicit images of blackness that deepen their sense of uncertainty and violence. So also, Melville uses Ishmael and Ahab. They racialized deliberations with Huikak and Pip to address the white protagonists, focus on acquiring self-mastery and mastery over others, in which their minds relieve the forceful disturbances that blackness represents. Okay. And Moby Dick, I'd like to quote from the book. Melville is definite about what the white whale means to Captain Ahab, who is hunting him across the world. Quote, all that most maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab, were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart shell upon it. Unquote. Okay. So we might ask ourselves, when Melville associates Pip with cowardice and Quicket with noble courage, he also unites these opposing figures through their important social attachments to the novel's leading white man, Ishmael and Ahab. And another striking similarity that they both undergo near-death experiences that D.H. Lawrence in his essay has a different interpretation of the whiteness of the whale. What then is Moby Dick? He's the deepest blood being of the white race. He's our deepest blood nature, and he's hunted by the maniacal fanaticism of our white mental consciousness. We want to hunt him down, to subject him to our will, and in this maniacal conscious hunt of ourselves, we get dark races and pale to help us, red, yellow, and black, east and west, Quaker and fire worshipper. We get them all to help us in this ghastly maniacal hunt, which is our doom and our suicide. So in Kukek's case, he nearly dies of fever. He is close to death. That Pip, who possesses heaven's sense, he offers to beat his tambourine for Kukek's dying march, and hence Kukek, sorry if I mispronounce, grabs his Negro idol. And also here, Pip, like Pip, as again, Kukek, for example, embodies overlapping realities. Ishmael finds himself mournfully drawn to the transition and progress, especially when he observes in Kukek that he says, quote from the book, and all that cannot be named, strange things, or his eyes is like the rings of eternity. So Ishmael sees death's code, but he cannot depict it. So when death imprints the last revelation, Ishmael confronts his interpretive and existential limits, since Melville explains also in the book that, quote, only an author from the dead could adequately understand what death begins to reveal to Kukek, unquote. So Melville deploys the interracial encounters between Ishmael and Kukek, as well as between Pip and Ahab, to call attention to how white characters experience what blackness signifies, and the violent disruptions that occur as they pursue knowledge of others' interiors or seek to master the absolute. Blackness, as Melville imagines it, has no tractable experience or reformative action to eradicate it. Characters neither overpower, vanquish, or nor traverse it. Even though dark visions constitute Ahab and repeatedly revisit Ishmael, the novel's episodes of interracial bonding contain an embodied blackness in Pip and Kukek that presents opportunities for both pairs of characters to change how They respond to traumatic changes. These interracial bonds exemplified by Melville through the images of the man rope from the book, the man rope, the bridegroom clasp, or they mediate the disturbances that haunt the protagonist's pursuit. So the Melville best expresses this temporary reprivation when Ishmael says, for example, to Quickeg, redeem me, or when Ahab implies that Pip can cure this melody, his melody. So this does not mean, of course, that any character can avoid the upheaval blackness represents, but in fact, the realization, we need to realize that blackness, destructiveness, and the uselessness points to the possibilities of the idea that blackness is something racially embodied and it's contained. So when we need to ask the question that, so while Moby Dick scenes of blackness do not present solutions to racialized social inequality in the United States or answers to questions like whether one can know truth, they confront us with the question, what must one sacrifice or be willing to give up for the prospect of social equality and humane change between the races? And Melville critiques racialized social inequality, yet he uses interracial bonds to undermine one's certainty about acquiring truth and attaining progress. So this paradoxically, Melville does criticize social inequality, as many of the critics accept, as yesterday most of our professors mentioned. Melville yet uses interracial bonds to undermine one's uncertainty or certainty about acquiring truth and attaining progress. So this paradoxically shows that Melville's subjects are fascinated and obsessed with visions of progress, attaining truth. So analyzing blackness and interracial encounters allows us to rethink the importance of Melville's portrayal of the experience of subjects trapped in unforeseen circumstances where all efforts to keep their social bearings intact and to ensure their conquest fail, or when they cherish truths, or when they vanish in the unpleasant violence. Okay, so to establish the link between whites' power over whether blacks or Indians that live or die on the stage of U.S. imperial expansion and Ahab and Ishmael's quest for mastery in the novel, I examine that in the chapter Triworks. It's associated with notions of power over dark others. And also, it's part of the inevitable progress of imperial power. So, while Melville certainly reproduces aspects of imperial conquest and capitalistic development, he also reaffirms his white protagonists' limitations by showing their powerlessness in the blackness of the darkness. It's a sense of horrific restriction, actually, that undermines all of these notions of the modern progress which built on racialized social hierarchies. So, let me change. I need to be quick, I guess. I gave some quotes from the novel, but I won't be reading them due to scarcity of time. I'll be shortly saying that whiteness is a veil, a shroud that makes evident a certain margin between the subject and those hidden truths of all subjects. There's a rootless equality in all subjects in the face of what whiteness represents. It is not just the nameless moral evil or reality's neutral face, but its undeniable allure and the force of its effects create a haunting obsession that can become anyone's personal devil. Thus, everyone is an infidel gazing at whiteness. Its truth simply is that to attempt to decipher beyond this brings overwhelming and appalling inner turmoil. Melville's whiteness cannot be historicized, but not because it's the real that is not real, but rather because whiteness is throughout all of history. Okay. I'd like to shortly sum up. So blackness in Moby Dick represents and reflects subject's condition of feeling inescapably tormented by time, history, and existence. And it happens once looking within and without. So when we go when we look from the broader sense, the ocean's endless seascape and the whiteness of the whale actually make occurrences of blackness visible. Blackness defines one's relation to the white owl that these entities produce in Ahab and Ishmael. So one of the best examples of Ishmael's embodiment of blackness is when Ishmael stares into a painting by the spotter in, I guess, he sees that uncountable messes, shades, and shadows. So you almost thought that some of ambitious young artists endeavored to delineate chaos bewitched. Also, I just opened the novel that I cut from the book, that I guess from the page 147 or so. So I close my speech here. And many thanks once again for listening, and for the people who organized this event. I appreciate their sincere efforts. Thank you very much for listening.
As we all know, artists reflect their surroundings and their beliefs in their works. Herman Melville himself was no different from the other artists. On the surface, Moby Dick seems like a novel about whaling and a specific madman's obsession over an indifferent sperm whale. However, as Melville tells the story of the crew of Pequod, a multiracial whaling ship that was named after an important war from the early American colony times, he actually gives aspects to the orders of American society of his time and his views on the issues of the era. Susan Garbarini Fanning explains the atmosphere that the novel was written as, and I'm quoted, written during the turbulent era of the congressional debates over slavery and Western territorial expansion. Moby Dick is a highly subtle aesthetic representation of the ideological turmoil that gripped the nation between 1820 and 1850, and unquote. Fanning also supports the idea that Melville was a political and satirical writer, as I want to add that. She explained that by political, she refers to Milton Sturm's sense of the term, that Melville is less concerned with the mere trappings of human politics, such as the party system or elections, than he is with deep attitudes and visions concerning the nature of human possibility, and therefore the nature and function of the state, the very concept of government. Although Moby Dick is not acknowledged as a satire in traditional sense, and its satirical tone seems secondary rather than primary to Shannon Louis Antoine, it can be said that Melville achieves to transfer his beliefs and the zeitgeist overall using satirical devices in Moby Dick. I divided the issues that Melville satirized into three categories, which are intertwined because of their nature: slavery, money, and Christianity. The basic goal of satire can be summarized as to present an attack on a specific or general human failing. The satirist attempts to produce in his reader a recognition of some defect or abuse in society, in a particular institution, or in human nature itself. The most elementary function of satire is thus to provide critical insights into the weakness and limitations of human nature. Charles Glicksberg states that Ishmael's voice in the novel probably goes parallel with Melville's own democratic, egalitarian sentiments. Ishmael has no objection anybody's religion so long as that person does not kill or insult others who fail to embrace that religion. It is the fanatic on religion who needs to be argued into sense. Throughout the novel, Melville shows extreme examples of fanaticism, whether it is materialistic or spiritual. By considering his standpoint, it can be easily pinpointed what he supports and what he is against. Melville's most common satiric method is to create a fictional world, which is a mirror image of the real world. In this fictional world, vice and folly appear in exaggerated comic form and are therefore readily apparent to the discerning reader, as Shannon Louis Anton says. According to Anton, he uses the techniques of imitative satire, parody, and caricature. As mentioned, the important topic of colonialism, colonialism was born out of financial reasons and took its strength from religion. Colonialists went to new lands and create new tradeways and agricultural areas. As we look into the early North American colonial history, we can see the history of exploitation of human labor and assimilation of other cultures and religions went hand in hand. Natives of the land were not human beings at the eyes of the colonists, mostly because of the religion issue. As Wanda Warren articulated in her book New England Bound, the initial seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as you can see on the screen, that was designed in 1629, displayed a mostly naked Indian man who put his weapons down and seemed to speak the words in English, "Come over and help us." She analyzes seal design as the biggest assistance the English could offer, in their own minds at least, was the ultimate help, salvation in the form of Christianity. 4 centuries later, the seal seems naive at best, a misdirection from the more realistic but less noble assessment that colonists had come to help themselves. As it can be seen throughout colonial history, Christianity did not cause salvation for the natives as it was promised. Perhaps Melville wanted to point out with these issues by giving examples from displaying together the religious man's cruelty and pagan character's virtue. In the 10th chapter of the book, A Bosom Friend, while Ishmael is analyzing Coiquec and his possible virtue as a pagan, he thinks, "There he said," and I'm quoted, "There he said, his very indifference speaking a nature in which there lurked no civilized hypocrisies and bland deceits. I'll try a pagan friend, thought I, since Christian kindness has proved but hollow courtesy." By creating a virtuous but pagan, even savage character, it is possible that Melville aims to satirize the actions of so-called civilized white Christian colonizers. This hollow Christian kindness that Melville mentions foreshadows the upcoming issue on the name of the ship. Choosing the name Pequot for the whaling ship cannot be a random action. There is a subtle correlation between colonization and whaling. The Pequot War was an important victory for both the English colonists and their alliances, Narragansetts and Mohegans. The war resulted in Englishmen to gain control of huge swaths of new lands and led to enslavement and commodification of hundreds of Indian war captives. However, as anyone can guess, the Pequot War also resulted with a massacre. As Warren described, one of the most brutal scenes of the war was the colonial soldiers. As Warren described one of the most brutal scenes of the war as the colonial soldiers set the Pequot village's wooden walls on fire. Pequots who attempted to flee the flames were shot or stabbed by armed English soldiers and their native allies, not simply burned to death. There were at least 400 Indians, mostly women, children, and old men. Also, Warren adds, any living hope of a gentle colonization surely died in the face of such massacre. Hence, Melville could have picked any other name for the ship, but he chooses the word that caused such a massacre and resulted a massive gain for colonization. Therefore, it can be said that Melville was aware of white man's wrongdoings and wanted to remind it once again in the form of the ship's name. Van der Warren also made a correlation between Melville's choice on the name of the ship and the war as well. Like the tribe, and I'm quoted, like the tribe, the ship suffered from the consequences of single-minded acquisitiveness. He, Melville, understood quite well how much suffering could derive from being in the way of fanaticism, spiritual or material. At some point, Christianity really transformed into a tool of salvation for the Indian slaves in the early years of colonization in North America. Indian slaves were willing to convert their children to Christianity with the hope that they might get to be free or get equal rights with the white Christian men. However, being a Christian could not save them from the slavery. Melville prefers the usage of irony throughout the novel, especially emphasized the differences between the corrupted white Christians with virtuous pagans. Captain Bildad can be considered as caricaturization of this emphasis. When the reader first comes across Captain Bildad, it is nearly impossible not to notice Melville's satirical note on his depiction of the old captain. Melville's description of old Bildad is full of oppositions and ironies. He bear as Melville, and I'm quoted from Melville, he bear arms against land invaders, yet himself had unlimitably invaded the Atlantic and Pacific. And though a sworn foe to human bloodshed, yet had he in his straight-bodied coat spilled tons upon tons of Leviathan gore. At this point, Ishmael questions Bildad's conscience. Therefore, in a way, Melville questions Christian colonist conscience as well and deducts the situation with one sentence. A man's religion is one thing and this practical world quite another. Thus, with a single sentence, Melville summarizes the whole colonial history. In the 16th chapter, when Captain Bildad and Captain Peleg argues about Ishmael's wage, Captain Bildad conveniently reads Treasures in Heaven chapter of Bible out loud, which you can see the verses on the slide. In this part, Melville's satirical tone and his humor can be depicted. While he was reading about not to collect the earthly possessions and not to bond with them, Bildad proposes a minimum wage for Ishmael. And I'm quoted from Melville, lay not upon for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth, the 777th wouldn't be too much, would it? Where moth and rust do corrupt, but lie. And in other page, the argue is continuing, 777th, or where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. In this argument, Bildad tries to support his wage idea with Bible verse, like colonists supports their idea to reach new land and to prosper with God's will. Melville, in a clever way, satirizes and caricaturizes these kinds of people. He almost paints a picture of what colonist conversations might look like while they are talking about slavery for their new land, as well as talking about God's words. In other words, Melville displays a parody of historical moments and the absurdity of the usage of religion by the colonists. Another significant caricaturized character would be Stubb. He is the opposite of Captain Ahab in every possible way. He enjoys earthly activities such as sleeping, eating, and to have a very strong desire towards financial commodities. Even though in the novel slavery is not emphasized, Melville does not neglect to mention this issue. The tragic character Pips falling into water and then losing his mind, one of the biggest tragedies in the book. However, his fall from the boat and the events that happened afterwards illuminate the zeitgeist of the American society before the Emancipation Bill. In the chapter, The Castaway, after Pip's first fall into the sea, Stubb calls Pip as, stick to the boat. Pip, or by the Lord, I won't pick you up if you jump, mind that. We can't afford to lose whales by the likes of you. A whale would sell for 30 times what you would, Pip, in Alabama. Bear that in mind and don't jump anymore. Regardless of the horrible statement, a life of a human being, a non-white slave to be exact, was worth less than a whale. In 19th century, whaling was a rewarding business. As Melville articulates with details, almost every piece of sperm whale was useful and worth something in the market. Even though there is an exaggeration in Stubbs' expression, compared to market worth of sperm whales, Pepys seems like he worth less in the market. One of the significant chapters of the book is the chapter Stubbs' Supper. In the chapter, we see Stubbs while eating whale steak after his victory over a whale. Displeased by the dryness of the steak and noisy sharks that he is continuously hearing, he summons the old black cook, Fleece, and orders him to preach to the sharks to keep them quiet. This absurd scene serves kind of a comedic relief. Not having any choice other than obeying the white master's order, Fleece begins to preach to the sharks like a religion clerk, but could not avoid Stubbs' scoldings. Stubbs says, "You mustn't swear that way when you are preaching. That's no way to convert sinners, cook." Later on, Fleece continues to preach to the shark as Stubbs' desire. In his preach, Fleece advises the shark not to be greedy, not to have someone else's whale, and not to try to eat their neighbor's sustenance. Even though it seems absurd, Fleece's preach is important if we consider before this comedic scene, Melville mentions slave ships crossing the Atlantic and how those ships have companionship with large numbers of sharks in an anticipation, a hilarious feast by a dead slave to be decently buried. By looking from this standpoint, it seems like Melville talks the colonist mindset and criticizes their action by satirizing this absurd interaction. At the end of the interaction, Stubbs, pleased by Fleece's preach, and says, "Well done, old Fleece, that's Christianity." That sentence is also ironic. Since the start of the novel, it seems like Stubbs was not a religious person, unlike Starbuck. Therefore, it can be interpreted as a white man decide what can be considered as good Christianity and what cannot, as if the religion is monopolized by a white man. As a result, this study will be aimed to analyze representation of slavery, colonialization, and religion and money, while examining Melville's satirical tone and his techniques to achieve satire on the social injustices in the novel Moby Dick.
So Melville wrote his Hunt for Moby Dick during a period in which the Americans were pursuing an aggressive policy of expansion, as we already heard before. Both their national territory and also their sphere of influence were steadily increasing. Looking at the painting by John Mast from 1872, named American Progress, we can see the national allegory of Columbia on her way to American West to spread her idea of civilization. When Captain Ahab sails across the Pacific and proclaims, "All ye nations before my brow, I bring the sun to you," many parallels open up with the earlier mentioned Columbia. In both cases, America is invading the spheres of other nations, whether they want it or not. This found reasoning in the so-called Manifest Destiny, the Central American policy of the 19th century. Called by John O'Sullivan in 1845, the term contained two assumptions embedded in society that justified the American imperialism and also shaped their national narrative. Melville addresses the Manifest Destiny in his epic by integrating two closely related facets of this ideology, which is providence and exceptionalism, along with the result of that, the imperialism. Therefore, I've taken a closer look at the representation of these three criteria, and I also analyzed them in more detail. The first piece of the puzzle is the sacred fact that American people were chosen. But as Stephenson states, the success of the enterprise is by no means predetermined, for it is based on a deal, and a deal can be broken, if not by God, then certainly by his people. The Israelites might renege by choosing to do wrong, as indeed they do again and again and for which they are roundly punished. History is in that sense essentially as a series of choices between right and wrong in relation to the contract. For the American Puritans, too, history was a chronological series of convenience and choices on the way, spatially and temporally, to salvation and redemption. So the colonization of America was also deeply connected to the Israeli exodus, and taking account that, or taking Melville's biographical background account with his religious education and also coming from a Calvinist Puritan family, also reveals his involvement in this environment. Ishmael himself opens this topic up right at the beginning, because doubtlessly my going on this whaling voyage formed part of the grand program of providence that was drawn up a long time ago. The importance of prophecy for Melville becomes obvious. However, the existence of these prophetic passages itself is not yet a straight reference to the manifest destiny. This connection becomes clear and revealing in the revealing chapter, The Prophet. Just days before the crew in Moby Dick is ready to depart, a man named Elijah appears to Ishmael and Queequeg. He predicts the doom of all those who set sail with Ahab, but his warning, it's all fixed and arranged. It's all fixed and arranged already. Sailors or others must go with him, I suppose, as well as these, as any other man. God pity him. Goes unheard as Ishmael decides to pronounce the prophet Elijah, or Elijah in this case, in his heart a humbug. As we heard already yesterday, the biblical connection of this passage, and in this case to the manifest destiny, seems too coordinated for Melville to have placed it there by any chance. If you look at the Old Testament book of Malachi, it says that before the great day of the Lord comes, a prophet named Elijah will appear. And in the book of Kings, also in the Bible, King Ahab of Israel harbored open hostility against this very prophet. King Ahab also desires the vineyard of a certain Naboth, since it borders his kingdom, and therefore makes him a financial offer. But after Naboth refuses to sell his heritage, he is getting murdered by a plot of Jezebel, as we also heard yesterday. Jezebel was the queen. When the king then seizes the vineyard of the murdered Naboth, Elijah appears again and predicts that his kin or family will be wiped out. The reference to the manifest destiny is kind of striking on closer reading, because at the heart of both scenarios is the conflict over land that has been held for generations by a faction that refuses financial compensation. In the 19th century politics, Americans favored this financial strategy, except with Native people, before then eventually always resorting to force by military. As in the religious narrative, so in the New World too, expansion is marked by violence and murder. Melville uses this prophetic logic to confront the political development in America, and therefore Ishmael prophesies a tragic fate for the nation if it corrupts providence. So much for the sacred part of the ideology. We can now move to the secular part of the manifest destiny, which is again the exceptionalism. When Ishmael informs us of America's maritime accomplishments, at first glance this is nothing more than a proud report of local whaling, or the local whaling industry itself. However, in the course of the story, this pride kind of condenses into an ambiguity that shows almost signs of nationalism. With the U.S. independence, the United States were by no means stable, and to be more clear, their identity was not stable, because unlike their counterparts, they had no unique characteristics. They shared a language with the British. Their territory was indefinable and varied, and the relationship of the states within the Union was also unclear. So apart from the Puritan-influenced idea of American chosen people in Providence, the young nation could not really rely on any national narrative compared to the long histories of other nations. As a result, America orientated and grounded their nation not in the past, but rather in the future. Melville referred to this concept in his book White Jacket, which was published shortly before Moby Dick. And there we read, the past is the textbook, the future is the Bible of the free. Therefore, the desired values of the New World were drawn up on to define national identity, from which a sense of American superiority over the old world emerged. For Ishmael, as he reveals in chapter The Advocate, the whalers themselves are not just brave fishermen. Rather, no one can point out a single peaceful influence which within the last 60 years has operated more potentially upon the whole broad world than the high and mighty business of whaling. Furthermore, Ishmael also states in the same chapter that they are not only pioneers who opened up colonies, but they're also mediators between nations. They are diplomats who defeated some jealous policy of European powers and also brought South American countries their democratic freedom. So in Melville's words, whaling is more than just a way to feed the industrial machinery of the Western world. It is a symbol of the realization of human prosperity. Therefore, if the Pequod is seen as a microcosm of a nation, the competence of a state is measured by its skills in whaling. Melville compares the new world with the old one, using jams as a metaphor for the clash of two nations, especially jams. Jams are the meeting of two vessels on open sea. So especially the jams with the continental European ships are relevant in the context of Manifest Destiny. In chapter 91, the Rosebud sails under the French flag, who has 2 rotten whales on board and is under the command of some former cologne manufacturer. On his instructions, the crew has to extract unusable oil of the whales, but they know nothing about the precious ambergris in their body. Together with the fact that the unsuccessful whaling ship carries a gold-colored lettering, the setting is an accumulation of stereotypes. When we read, but they worked rather slow and talked very fast and seemed in anything but good humor. The representation of European incompetence is even intensified by the fact that the captain, due to his former profession, should actually be familiar with ambergris and also knows origins, because ambergris was a main part of cologne back in the days. Melville therefore creates a humorous image of a facile, weak, and unsuccessful France through Stubbs' insult of a crapaud. I hope I pronounced it right. And this American superiority is also evident in the case of the German Dutch ship, the Virgin. There we read, immediately turning the conversation to his lamp feeder and oil can with some remarks touching his having to turn into his hammock at night in profound darkness, his last drop of Freeman oil being gone, and not a single flying fish he had captured to supply the deficiency, concluding by hinting that his ship was indeed what in the fishery is technically called a clean one, that is, an empty one, well deserving the name of the Jungfrau or the Virgin. After the Pequod donates oil to the European crew, there's a joint sighting of whales. So both ships kind of attack the whales. But we also read, but so decided an original start had Derrick, the captain of the German ship, that despite of all their gallantry, he would have proved the victor of in this race had not the righteous judgments descended upon him. The crew of the Pequod manages to win the race. Although the Europeans, due to their already lowered boats, had a great advantage. Not only are the Europeans incapable of fulfilling their task as whalers, just as the Virgin had a head start on the prey, likewise the European nations have an historical advantage over the still young United States in their historical identity. Despite the symbolic, Europeans fail to achieve their task as a nation. Melville therefore emphasizes the abilities of the Americans through the Pequod, but in the same way, in the same move, notices the stagnation of the European nations. So these two aspects of the Manifest Destiny, the logic of prophecy and the exceptionalism of Americans, were the justification for the resulting economically and reinforced imperialism. Ishmael tells us in chapter 89, Fast Fish, Loose Fish, that the means of settling dispute over prey on open sea is a symbol of possession to distinguish the loose fish from a fast fish. But he notes that regardless of this legal construct, in reality, it always boils down to the right of the strongest that legitimizes any occupation. He concludes, possession is half of the law. That is, regardless of how the thing came into possession, but often possession is the whole of the law. Ismail's account of maritime possession serves as a symbolic criticism of the annexation of foreign territories, referring to the imperial ambitions of the United States. This expansion began with the violent expulsion of Native Americans, and as Dilara also mentioned right before, by placing symbolic America on the Pequod and letting it continue its expansion on the ocean, Melville creates a memorial to that displacement. And in rating the stereotypes of these native people, such as sea pastures or white rolling watery prairies, to Ahab's foray into Japanese waters, he kind of makes a connection between the American westward movement and the contemporary United States foreign policy of forcefully opening Japan. That Melville must have been critically aware of these political facts becomes also clear when he refers to the contemporary imperialism towards other North American states. For Ishmael himself, compares the law of the strongest to exactly this movement. He says, what's to that populistic lancer, Brother Jonathan is Texas but a fast fish. Brother Jonathan was the male national allegory before Uncle Sam. Alternatively, he also mentions the most recent events. What at last will Mexico be to the United States? All loose fish. The reference to the steady progress of American annexations, the link to the displacement of indigenous people, and also the demise of the ship of state that occurs at the end of the story, advocate an interpretation that critiques manifest destiny's expansion and seizure of other nations. So let's try a conclusion. While Melville wants the country itself to recognize the signs of a departure from the actual providence, he kind of cannot avoid giving expressions to his American nationalism by praising the nation for its success. Nevertheless, he condemns the imperialism that results from it. It may be paradoxical that he is critical towards the result of the manifestation, but also seems to support individual ideas that support that ideology. However, this understanding is less, in my opinion at least, less paradoxical than ambivalent, because it must be remembered that Melville existed not detached and isolated from his normative environment. And even if he held some extremely liberal views, he is still a child of his time in which nationalism was not necessarily negatively tainted, but attitudes towards imperialism, on the other hand, were more ambitious, especially in America. Basically, John McWilliams is right when he calls the situation a critical national optimism on the part of Melville. But since Melville does not clearly comment on these political events in his diaries, the question always arises to what Melville says in Moby Dick and what Ishmael says. Thank you very much.
Today, I will briefly talk about how we can read European colonialism from a new historical perspective through two important works by Herman Melville, Moby Dick and Benito Sereno. One of the frequent topics in American studies is the colonial activities of European countries such as Spain and Britain in the Americas. The majority of this research has used outdated methods, old historical materials, and same discourses. So, to analyze these colonial activities objectively, today's historians have to embrace a wide range of methodologies. When critics such as Stephen Greenblatt developed the notion of new historicism in 1980, which views all literary works as historiography, it enabled academics to reinterpret history from a different perspective. Although American literary works are suitable to be analyzed through such lens and rich in canonical works about colonialism, there are limited academic studies. Therefore, to fill this lack, and in order to understand the dynamics of both Spanish and English colonialism effect on the Americas, one of the global Anglophone literature authors, Herman Melville, can be chosen because of his dual perspective in his books. He lived in the era of mercantilism and was a seaman himself, who participated in activities like whaling that reflects the imperialist and expansionist mindset of the American colonies. That is why his writings can be used to find evidence for and against the historical occurrences that are chronicled in the history books. Although his books were mostly studied in terms of British colonialism, Hispanic scholars emphasize to a lesser extent Spanish colonial themes in his writings as well. It is a well-known and accepted fact that Melville was greatly influenced by Spain and Spanish culture, language, and literature. In fact, he was so accustomed to the culture that even colleagues like Hawthorne couldn't distinguish him from a Spanish gentleman. In addition to reading works such as Don Quixote, in particular, he played an important role in changing the superficial use of Spanish culture and literary values in American literature. The storyteller's management of Spanish and Spanish-American themes became gradually more sophisticated during his time. That is why his books are precious resources to analyze Spanish history and colonialism. In order to move in this way, it is important to first examine the historical events and processes that are presented to us as facts in British and Spanish colonial activities before beginning to examine history through literary texts. In both the Age of Sail and the Age of Discovery, European powers were ambitious to find new resources both in terms of lands and human labor. With this intention, they traveled across the oceans, discovered new lands, and then began to exploit them. These countries were different from one another in terms of their colonialist attitudes, since some of them practiced settler colonialism, while others chose exploitive colonialism. In order to clarify how these notions emerge and what they signify, one can look at Tamer Herzog's book called Frontiers of Possession, Spain and Portugal in Europe and the Americas. As she demonstrates, during the 16th century, discussions in Europe about colonial activities in the newly discovered areas came to a conclusion when Thomas More made emphasis on cultivation and agriculture. He claimed that natives in the Americas have more soil than they can cultivate. Therefore, in order not to waste these soils, Europeans can and should colonize these areas. Thus, by this emphasis on this agricultural activity, Spaniards were seen as only conquerors because their ambitions and acts were not related to the soil's cultivation. On the other hand, the English were indeed settler colonials because they penetrated the territories of nomadic tribes that were still vacant. In this process of exploring, claiming land and natural resources, and enslaving indigenous people, Spain's motivations were God, gold, and glory, and these ambitions were most of the time presented in a negative discourse in the historical records, which created a black legend. This legend was mostly created by other European countries and was used as a justification for their own colonial activities in the future. Even though it is really hard to distinguish what is real and what is a myth about the Spanish presence on the Great Plains, it is undeniable that Spanish colonization activities still have many aspects to criticize. For example, as Ralph Vigil stated in his articles and his books, although Spain tried to portray its actions as modern actions of Renaissance people, as can be understood from the cruelty of their actions, they actually acted with a mentality based on the Middle Ages. He clarifies that Spain did not act with motivations such as glorifying humanity, individuality, and a curiosity for science. Rather, their actions were fueled by knowledge, motives, legends, and myths of the medieval age, and of course, Bible. The conquistadors, who set out on the condition that their economic goals should support military and religious values, went in search of hidden kingdoms and riches promised in the ancient texts. In this process, with the conversion activities, their cruel behaviors gradually began to turn into Inquisition activities. The acts of this nation, which showed examples of exploitative colonialism, started to be justifiable reasons for the British in time. For this nation, the role they set for themselves was different from that of the Spaniards. As the chosen ones who came to take the promised land, they became saviors for the natives and the world. Yet their aims still can be categorized under the God, glory, and gold trinity, because although they claim to have different aims, they actually serve the same motivations by spreading Protestantism instead of Catholicism, adding more land and material income to the British kingdom. But their biggest difference is that they played the role of a messiah, and I think Melville clearly touches upon this role in his well-known protagonist, Captain Delano from Bento Sereno, who saved the crew. Before delving into these kinds of analysis of the books, it is necessary to mention a little bit about New Historicism. Developed through the works of critic Stephen Greenblatt, this theory, as a reaction to new criticism, suggests that literary works cannot be considered isolated from historical, cultural, and social circumstances. Therefore, all literary texts can also be read as historical texts. Beginning in the 1960s, a post-structuralist revolution sparked the development of fresh approaches to historical analysis. During this phase, critics began to focus on four main approaches. 1. The history is a narration and is always subjected to representations. 2. There cannot be a single history. 3. The past is something people constructed through written text. And finally, if the past is a composition of already written text, then the literary text should also be considered as a part of historytelling. At this point, with this background, we can turn back to Herman Melville's books because, as I said, they are essential for comprehending European imperialism in general as well as Spanish colonialism in the Americas. In the beginning of Moby Dick, by emphasizing that every human being is a slave to something or someone and oppression is universal, Melville makes the issue of colonialism one of the dominant themes in the book. Later, the issue intensifies and becomes clear, especially in the Fast Fish and Loose Fish chapter. In this chapter, Melville clarifies the issue of possession by underlying concepts such as imperialism, mercantilism, colonialism, and even slavery with the metaphor of whaling. By defining what is fast and what is loose, Melville clearly sheds light on the colonial activities on the American continent and the conflicts of the European nations. The lands, riches, and the natives of the Americas have been the subject of debate for a long time by European civilizations. The question of who is the first to discover the continent, to establish the first settlements, or to be the first to reach resources has created a big problem, for example, between Portugal and Spain first, then between Spain and England. Through various religious and secular laws, both lands and natives have been claimed by many violent and non-violent acts. First, exploring and conquering, making agreements, and converting the local people both religiously and socially was the only criterion, and therefore the Americas were Spanish fast fish. But the lands quickly turned into loose fish for England, of a change in the criterion which emphasizes cultivating and settling. After this important chapter, with the doubloon that appears in the story, the theme of Spain, Spanish colonialism, and the conflicts between English and Spanish colonialists gradually intensify, even though it is not shown explicitly. The fact that gold as a material value became a motivation tool, and Ahab's obsession with Moby Dick became even with the doubloon in time, have been analyzed in some academic studies as the British fondness for the American lands in the hands of the Spaniards. For example, in Zachary Michael Redford's thesis, he analyzes the coin through a capitalist perspective and emphasizes how it refers to the economic ambitions of imperialist European powers. He says, quote, "This Spanish coin, forged in Quito, Ecuador, South America, is a representative artifact of the once vast Spanish Empire that assumed control over native people of the South America and territory in much of the same manner as Europeans did North America." In Moby Dick, Melville uses this coin to represent the expansiveness of the American Empire as it took over the hemispheric control that once seemed to belong in the South to the Spanish Empire. Unquote. Doubloon appears as a symbol that has many meanings in its first introduction to the book. It has great material, spiritual, and symbolic value. From a material point of view, gold is already very valuable for both the crew and the Ahab because it is gold, which is a reference to mercantilism and capitalism. The fact that it's a gold from South America makes it convenient for us to interpret it from different perspectives as well. First of all, Ahab's passion for this coin describes a Spaniard's thirst for American land. Then it reflects the British ambitions for these precious lands in the hands of the Spaniards. So as you see, there's a dual perspective. If it's analyzed from a symbolic and spiritual point of view, it symbolizes the fertile South American lands with the carving and decorations on the coin almost resembling a small map, and also reflects the mythical value attributed to these lands with esoteric symbols on it like zodiac circle. The reinforcement of Ahab's obsession with Moby Dick, which can be interpreted by some Hispanic academics as the Americas, the lens itself, and with coin also complete the colonial reading, because although Ahab says he will give this coin to the first person who sees the whale, in the end he declares that the only person that will gain the coin is himself. Again, in the same context, Spanish-English colonialism and slavery were handled in Benito Cereno, and Captain Delano was portrayed as an American hero with strong common sense and reasoning, although he is not. At this point, the Spaniards were shown as weak and needy in the face of the savages they enslaved. Thus, a contrasting image of glorious conquistadors in their own historical sources emerged. With the image of a ship where nothing is as it seems, Melville explicitly challenges many historical realities. For example, it is depicted that there was a disease on the ship and that Spaniards on the ship died because of it, while most of the African slaves survived. Although it turns out that this is a complete lie at the end of the story, it is known that the diseases brought by the Europeans caused the deaths of lots of natives and later slaves in the Americas. Here, a counter-reality is created and Serrano is shown as the illest person, both mentally and physically. Also, in the story, there are lots of elements from the Inquisition. With an alternative historiography narrative, Melville shows Serrano and his crew as victims of the Inquisition. In addition to depicting the sad state of Spaniards who seem to be paying the price for what they have done, he also offers a different perspective on this historical reality with scenes reminiscent of Inquisition rituals. In this way, he questions the brutal activities of the Inquisition and, like a historian, discusses who and what it badly affected. He, therefore, actually challenges the Black legend. The techniques he uses in his writing also make this book look like a historical document. The author, who adds a formality to the story, especially with the testimony part at the end of the book, forces his readers to think about the reality of all this. But also, we know that he wrote this short story after incidents of Amistad and Creole ships, which also contributes to the story's analysis through a new historicist perspective. Finally, what conclusion can be drawn from all this? Well, in Moby Dick, from my perspective, Melville wrote his story in a way that supports yet criticizes historical facts, although this book is open to many readings. Many historical facts are implicitly presented, and the dual perspective of Melville, who was both an American and a global writer, is clearly seen. In his work, Benito Cereno, Melville provides a different perspective on the historical realities of Spanish colonialism. Everything is more explicit in here. For example, the prejudices and reservations brought about by Delano's being an Anglo-American are clearly shown, which support historical documents that describe how the British viewed the Spaniards, or let's say how Anglo-Americans saw Ibero-Americans at the time. However, in both of his books, Melville openly criticizes one certain issue, which is that the activities of colonialism and capitalism harm people, because in both stories, a death theme dominates the ships, both in their structural form and in the atmosphere. Picot being decorated with dead animal bones and Serrano's having a dead man's skeleton in front of his ship. The captains who set out with such ships eventually and inevitably die as victims of their greed, suffering both physically and emotionally.
So today in my presentation, I will be explaining you
what I constantly felt throughout reading the novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville, which was actually a occurring question in my mind. What does Ahab and Ishmael see in Moby Dick? They are really different. They comprehend very, very different things, even though they look at the same whale. And I was wondering, what does it mean about them if they see this vividly different things from one whale? So my topic will be perception, because usually when we wonder about like, what does Ahab see or what does Ishmael see in Moby Dick, we usually answer with, oh, their perspectives are different. But that's actually not enough. And I wonder why their perspectives are this different. Why Ahab sees all the evilness in Moby Dick and why Ishmael is so romantic about it. What is the reason for their perceptions? So I realized that they look at the same whale, but they see really different things. So there's only one real thing. The only reality is the whale. It's the only real, but our perceptions are so fragmented. So there's a relativity. Throughout the history of philosophy, all thinkers, authors, and philosophers were in the search for absoluteness, right? But at this point, the absolute thing is the white whale, but our perceptions are so different. So what are we going to do now? What does it mean if our perceptions doesn't mean anything if the whale is just a whale? So I'm going to be studying this. But in order to do this, like in order to look at Ahab and how does he perceive, how does Ishmael perceive, and how does their perception affect themselves? And most importantly, what is Moby Dick all alone, without any human interpretation, without any convictions of human conscience? What is it? And in order to question this, we need a phenomenological way to question things. So phenomenology is actually a philosophical way to answer our questions on perception and what the object is only by its own essence, without any human consciousness. What is it all alone? So that's why I need to use phenomenological questions in order to investigate reality, the reality of Moby Dick. So that's why I suggest to consider Moby Dick as a phenomenal object, while considering Ahab and Ishmael as the two different subjects experiencing it. So there is a phenomenal object and two subjects. Then which Moby Dick is the real one? That's my question. Is there even a real Moby Dick? So throughout the narrative, we feel the presence of Melville. He is coming to the narration embodied as Ishmael sometimes and then as a narrator, but he constantly reminds his readers that nature is superior, and no matter what we perceive from it, we cannot overcome its power. So our ideas do not change the reality of nature. Ocean is just an ocean, the whale is just a whale, and our perceptions do not construct the absoluteness, because the real one is the whale, not our ideas. If you think about Plato's allegory of the cave, still it's really controversial, because where is this ideas world? Where are they? Where are these ideas? They're not comprehensible as strong as the whale. So humans perceive reality is fragmented, it's relative and not absolute, which is actually quite upsetting and depressing for humankind, because we are so used to feel dominance over nature and objects. But it's not a good feeling to be a Melvillian hero in his world, because the way he structures his narrative, we feel like the nature like a Herculean entity. So think about nature as a chessboard, and humans and our perceptions are just Machiavellian pawns that no matter how cryptic we are, no matter how strategic we think, to hunt Moby Dick, actually the field is the same. The field is nature, and it doesn't get affected by us that easily
because we see, you know, all the dreams in the Pequod, everyone, the crewmate, they just die, except one person. So it's not a good concept to be a human in Melvillian hero. It's not appealing to us because we tend to put meanings for everything. And as I said, it's really upsetting and depressing to be in his, did something happen to Zoom? Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I thought it was gone for a second. So yes, as I said, it's not a good concept to be a hero in his world. So what are we going to do? If all of our perceptions are discorrupted, if our meanings doesn't mean anything under the name of absoluteness, what are we going to do? What is the purpose of our livings and comprehendings if we do not have the power of a subject against an object? Because we tend to think we are subjects, we are dominant and superior over objects. So Melville's narration makes the reader question and reshape, restructure the boundaries of subjects and objects, which makes us as subjects less powerful and objects more powerful. But it's not a good concept for us. We are not used to that. So what are we going to do in this position? Like, if we need to change whole understanding of our being subject or the outer reality being an object, what are we going to do? So there's no point of our comprehendings. Thank God there is a French philosopher named Merleau-Ponty who interrogates and questions perception and what can it teach us exactly. So his point of view is going to help us from the depressing and not really appealing narration of Melville, because of the way he puts the boundaries between being a subject and object. Merleau-Ponty actually suggests that if I'm the subject, then I should be dominant. But if I am the object, like if I don't mean anything in this world, then why do I even exist? And I know that I perceive things. So how does this perception process and what can I learn from it? Merleau-Ponty stops this dilemma of subject-object dualism. He says this concept of thinking as dualism is an ontological cross-eye, where we think one thing as two. So we think us as either subjects and the other things as objects. This is an ontological cross-eye, he says. So he says that things can be both of them. You don't need to separate them into two as subjects or objects. That's why he argues our bodies. So now I want you to think about your own bodies. What do you think it is? Is your body a subject or an object? This argument actually helps us to reconstruct the boundaries between them, because if you say my body is an object, then how can you ever possibly exist in this material world? Because you can't not sell this argument to someone who doesn't believe in soul, because they believe they have one life. They're going to be in this world within this body. I am my body, and I cannot underestimate this. But if you think you are only a subject, like an idealist would say, think about the smart watches that you use, that you put around your wrist. They measure your heartbeat, your calories, how many steps you take in a day. They objectify your body. They remind you that your body is just like a tool. Even the machines can objectify them. So what are we going to do? Is it an object or a subject? Merleau-Ponty says it is both of them. So he again proves the fall of the absoluteness, and he reaches to an arrival to a point of balance where we don't need to be in the polars of like being a subject or an object. He says actually we are both of them. And I think his words in the book of Phenomenology of Perception are, this quotation is really good. He says, quote, we must not therefore wonder whether we really perceive a world. We must instead say the world is what we perceive. So we are slightly acknowledging what Melville was trying to say is not actually so depressing. The world is what we perceive. It's still like that. So perception is a system of meanings by which a phenomenal object is recognized. And still this phenomenal object is Moby Dick. Don't forget that. We're still on Moby Dick. It is the phenomenal object, and Ahab and Ishmael are perceiving it. So, but we cannot perceive it only by our rationalist or empirist ways, because it again structures us in between being an idealist or it objectifies us. But again, we need to find a balance between them. We need to reach a reality that is not absolute. Yes, we acknowledge that there is no such thing as absoluteness, that we cannot reach it by our perceptions. But Merleau-Ponty says the real is a closely woven fabric, which is going to make even more sense when I talk about Ishmael and his perception. The real is a closely woven fabric in which we get the feeling of a unity where everyone is in this production of what is real. And through that, being can be reached through phenomenology, which is a philosophy which puts essences back into existence. So now I can really start on what is Ahab's concern, what does it see in Moby Dick, and what does it really say about him, and why does it kill him? So Ahab, as we all know, is a really idealist man who thinks that the Moby Dick he convinces himself to kill is the absolute truth. Moby Dick is absolutely all the evilness in the whole world, because it took off his leg. He destroyed his life. It destroyed his life, and it symbolizes God's unfair disorder. So he wants to kill this Moby Dick in order to prove his existence to God, to resist him, to say that the reality is what is resisting against me, and I'm not acknowledging that. He doesn't accept being objectified by nature. He's so used to being a subject and being superior to nature. But this idealist approach for perceiving actually creates an ambition for him, and this ambition coaxes him into a paradise where he is the superior power. But it's just a trick. It's not real. Moby Dick is not that cruel or wicked, and he doesn't matter the most when it comes to structure and reality. And eventually, we all know that Ahab dies, and his understanding of Moby Dick is probably the main reason why this happens like that, because a life based on revenge against the chaos of nature doesn't end well, because again, you're not as powerful as you think a subject would be, or you're not as weak or as underestimated thing that you can consider as an object would be. Merleau-Ponty says, the real is a closely woven fabric. It does not await for our judgments before incorporating with most surprising phenomena or before rejecting the plausible figments of our imagination. Ahab cannot accept this because he lost his leg, he lost his life. He cannot think otherwise. That's why this idealist and stubborn perception eventually leads him to death, and Melville, I think, reminds us that through an idealist perception, one cannot survive. But on the other hand, when we come to Ishmael, he starts his journey just like Ahab. He is not really different from him, but in a more positive way. He's too romantic. He sees like all the wonders in Moby Dick. He wants to run away from the lands to discover the seas. He wants to be out of his character, to be someone else. He just wants to run away from his obscurity. And, sailing to nature and the vast ocean is not a good idea for him, because we realize that his idealist perception vividly changes the moment where he goes to the masthead, but he realizes that there is a chance of falling to sea, and nature wouldn't even care. He would just die with all his dreams and all his ambitions, and nothing would matter. So we see an acceptance in Ishmael. He realizes that he is not superior as a subject, and I think he finds this balance between subject and object where he constructs a brand new perception, which is impartial conscious, that doesn't rely on subjectivism or objectivism. He is in the middle. So his understanding of reality changes because of that too. We know that he believes in a mad maker God, which is what I said at the beginning of my presentation. He really resembles Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty says, quote, "The world is not an object such that I have in my possession the law of its making. It's the natural setting of and the field for all my thoughts and all my explicit perceptions." So we see that the point and the climax that Ishmael is going through is much more peaceful one. He's still a Melvillian hero, but he found the balance between, losing himself like Ahab or not even daring to be on a whale ship. He's in the middle, and this quotation especially sounds exactly like something Ishmael would say, but this is actually a quotation from Merleau-Ponty. He says, quote, "My thoughts and his are interwoven into a single fabric," unquote. So I want you to imagine like a vast fabric that every individual is woven by their perceptions. And at the end, if we look at it from an point of view, like as a God would do, it's like a huge fabric, but everyone wowed with their perceptions, and that is the real. But we tend to see the parts that we wowed. We sometimes forget that it is a complication of other people's consciousness and their perspectives and their perceptions. After he reaches that realization, I think this is where Melville structures a very didactic influence on his readers, because we know that everyone dies from the shipwreck, but Ishmael, he doesn't die because he reaches a kind of balance between, as I said, being a subject and object. He accepts his defeat, but he still is so enthusiastic about being alive. He changes his perspective and perception from focusing on being, like Ahab did, and he turns his face into a process of becoming rather than being, as Ahab did. Merleau-Ponty says, quote, "The world is not what I think, but what I live through." Remember when, before Ishmael started to sail, he said that, "I want to see the world," to Captain Peleg. And Captain Peleg said, "Can't you see the world from where you are standing?" This is actually one of the first loomings that we get the idea that Ishmael is going to change, but not yet. Melville is constantly reminding us Ishmael is not going to be this idealist like Ahab, because we see that his acceptance eventually is going to lead his survival. As I said, I studied Ahab, Ishmael, their perceptions, but there's the real one is the whale, right? No matter what we perceive, there's a whale called Moby Dick, which actually is not all the beauty in the world, like the secrets and the mystery in the world, like Ishmael thinks, or he is not the evilness that and God's unfair order that Ahab convinced himself. The whale is neither of them. It's just indifference that has nothing to do with people, actually, and we tend to misunderstand Moby Dick. As I said, Ishmael's survival to, his reach for acknowledging this indifference is, I think, Melville's didactic manifestation in order to, this is a way to survive this world. You cannot survive if you behave like Ahab, and you cannot survive if you keep on naming things. There's no such thing as Moby Dick. We are faced with the problem of naming. The whale doesn't need our convictions. It is not a Moby Dick. It is just a whale, because once we attach a name to it, we attach an identity and we dare to reshape the object when it is just a whale. So it's important to not forget that the title of the book is Moby Dick or the Whale. We should not forget that. And our perceptions are really crucial since they construct our realities, and it leads to our either death or survival. And our perceptions do not offer solutions, yes, because they're fragmented, but through phenomenology, they illustrate questions one might neglect to ask and therefore face. I believe Melva's narration is an invitation to didactically influence readers to kill their Ahab sides and hold on to Ishmael's, because that is the way to survive. Yes, thank you for listening.
Thank you. And my book chapter is entitled The Haunted House, a Gothic reading of Moby Dick. And today I will be discussing the tier of Eco-Gothic in Moby Dick under the metaphor of haunted house, relating it to the idea of excess and the otherness. But before diving into the specifics of it, I want to briefly introduce theoretical background of my book chapter. So let's see how Eco-Gothic manifests itself in the novel and how it contributes to the novel's haunting atmosphere. You may be wondering what Eco-Gothic is, so I can say that Eco-Gothic is a relatively new term used to describe a subgenre of Gothic literature that concentrates on the relationship between humans and their environment. It emerged in the 21st century as a response to the growing concerns about environmental problems and the impact of human activity on the natural world, often highlighting the destructive consequences of human actions. And Simon Istock, one of its most vocal critics, has linked Eco-Gothic to ecophobia, which is the emotional fear, disdain, indifference, or lack of mindfulness towards nature as a result of its unpredictability, where nature becomes a force of terror. And the dark nature as a threatening force is a foundational element of Eco-Gothic. This menace can assume the form of a nature that has been given a certain agency, one that actively seeks out retribution or revenge for perceived wrongs of the past or present, whether through a whale, a plant, or maybe even a landslip. So the agential nature actively takes revenge on humanity for its actions in Eco-Gothic. I chose the haunted house metaphor because the Gothic tradition often uses the metaphor of a haunted house, castle, or space to refer to any setting or circumstance that is filled with negative feelings, experiences, memories, or traumas with a ghostly atmosphere. So this house can include any post-traumatic event that leaves a sense of fear or anxiety. In Moby Dick, the peacock takes the shape of a haunted house, which is described as Ahab's cabin or even a doomed boat, and within the context of Eco-Gothic, a threatening force that is seen as nature. This house, followed by a ghostly creature, aids in addressing the traumas and anxieties buried in relation to social and environmental crises, so that the interconnectivity of humanity can be realized. So how does this threatening force find itself in Eco-Gothic? Professor Fred Botting says Gothic is a writing of excess. It appears in the awful obscurity that haunted 18th century rationality and morality. The Gothic actually represents a kind of shadowy excess to the Enlightenment's claims of progress and rationality. So what becomes excess in Eco-Gothic then? In Eco-Gothic, I argue that the concept of excess is associated with nature, a force that humanity has long regarded as potentially dangerous due to its unpredictability and sheer vastness. This fear of the unknown is similar to the fear found in traditional Gothic literature, but in Eco-Gothic, it becomes ecophobia, which speaks to our inability to fully comprehend or control nature's complexity. So when nature's complexity is the case, to take their ecophobia under control, humans have developed strategies which aim to control nature, to protect themselves from it. Throughout history, whether through colonialism or imperialism, humans have attempted to control what they perceive to be non-human, frequently by attempting to limit nature's perceived excess to a manageable level so that in that they can be the winner. As our ability to manage the physical environment decreases, so our protective strategies become more aggressive in order not to fail in the end. And therefore, in Moby Dick, I argue that the great white whale is the representation of nature, therefore the excess. In 19th century, with the industrialization, whale populations decreased due to overfishing, because as a result of overfishing, whales were used for their blubber to make perfumes, soaps, or even candles. And this disrupted their habitats, which caused a decrease in their reproductive rates, making them unable to replenish their population. And as a result, this resulted in an imbalance in the ocean's ecology, changing the food chain too. And all of this actually can be seen as a result of the idea of Western civilization, which is something that Ishmael sees as a bloody business. And in the novel, the mad captain Ahab is driven by the fear of the unknown and ecophobia that drives him to assert his power or authority over the white whale. His relentless pursuit for control or authority has been deeply rooted in the American consciousness, from the belief in manifest destiny to the ideals of exceptionalism, colonialism, and imperialism through westward expansion. Then it can be said that Ahab is haunted by these concepts to the point that his attitudes are seen as ecophobic symptoms, where he cannot help but conceptualize the white whale and seeing it as a monster terrorizing the New England whaling industry in the middle of the nautical frontier and all destroying force with outrageous strength and an inscrutable thing that breeds hatred. And I argue that the white whale is not necessarily evil in the traditional sense, but it is a force that is seen as excess, one that defies human understanding and control. Consequently, the boundary Ahab creates is drawn in the realm of what is acceptable and therefore human. Thus, the unpredictability of the whale ends up in the dichotomy of human versus nature, which makes Ahab view the whale as a threat to human dominance and Western civilization and destroy it on the behalf of mankind. Because according to Ishmael, Ahab seems to be carrying all the hate of the entire human race from Adam down and seems to be seeing a whale as an evildoer or a villain. However, the whaling industry is dependent on the presence and the behavior of whales, and the pequod must navigate the unpredictable and the dangerous elements of the sea. Thus, the white whale can be seen as a microcosm of the interdependent relationship between human culture and the natural world, whose every existence depend on each other's cooperation. Therefore, the white whale's power and agency are forces that combat the ills of capitalism, imperialism, and the brutality inflicted by the whaling industry, defying human attempts to control nature and deconstructing our perspective of what it means to be excess. And when we come to the otherness, isn't Gothic all about making the familiar stranger fearful? And the Gothic genre has long been fascinated with the idea of otherness, an outsider or unfamiliar entity that is seen as threatening to the status quo. And it can manifest in many forms, from a monstrous creature to a supernatural being, to a character who is marginalized or oppressed in some way. So in Eco-Gothic, the strangeness is produced by nature, introducing us terrifying elements in a familiar context so that we can see how destructive we are. So I can say that the familiar is the intimate, and the intimate is private. And private is hidden, the hidden is the other, and what is other in ecologic is nature. And the natural world and the veil in Moby Dick. And humanity's own greed and fear of the unpredictable nature leads him to create an other and impose the otherness on it. Yet nature is the reflection of humanity in the novel, and the veil serves as a kind of a mirror for humanity. And the notion of otherness can also involve a representation of a doppelganger or double, which has its roots in German Romanticism and has since become a canonical figure in Gothic literature. Doppelganger is often seen as an uncanny and unsettling presence that represents an alternative self or a mirror image of the protagonist, reflecting the character's innermost fears or desires. Arguably, I can say that the idea of the doppelganger can be connected to the instability of the lines separating human and non-human entities in Eco-Gothic. Ahab does see the white whale as a fierce and relentless monster, something that is fundamentally different and separate from him and the human world, where he sees all the demonisms and evilness personified in the whale. And in many ways, the white whale is Ahab's doppelganger, an inseparable part of him that reveals itself through its evilness and its own whiteness. And through this revelation, it challenges the boundaries between human and non-human, predictable and unpredictable, familiar and unfamiliar, known and unknown. So blurring boundaries is a key feature of the doppelganger, which often represents a distorted or mirrored version of the self that challenges the protagonist's sense of reality in a way. So in this sense, in Moby Dick, we can say that the whale swims to the surface of the dark ocean. It's a massive whiteness, serving as a reminder of the destruction brought by humans. It also reflects how the whales have been treated by people who have reduced them to nothing more than a commodity and hunted and consumed them only for their blubber. On one hand, the whale's dark presence serves as a reminder that our actions have terrible effects on nature that are irreversible, and it can be seen in the first quotation. So if you attempt to kill nature, it will kill you right back. It is also self-destructive. And the whale's evilness is unleashed upon those who cross it in the novel. The idea of the whale as an evil doppelganger is related to the erasure of whales through nature and its demonization by the whaling industry and those who benefit from it. In the same way, colonial powers will often erase the cultures and histories of the lands they colonize, painting the people and their ways of life as savage and inferior in order to justify their exploitation and oppression. And in the novel, we are not faced with the white whale as an embodiment of our destruction that is slowly destroying all that we had once built. So the whale's actions can be seen as a response to this treatment, a reminder that nature will always fight back against destruction, which is a clear symbol that our progress is not sustainable and that we must find a new way to live in harmony with nature if we hope to survive. Ishmael says Puqueak was a native of Kokooko, an island far away to the west and south. It is not done in any map, true places never are. So I can say that colonial powers saw the lands they colonized as empty canvases, ready for them to brush their own values and systems onto their disregard the already established cultures and histories of those nations, erasing them from existence. Therefore, the evilness of the white whale can be also seen as a representation of destructive effects of the idea of Western civilization, which has caused immense damage to the natural world and biodiversity. Like Ahab, Western civilization has been on a relentless pursuit of power and dominance for centuries, taking no notice of the consequences their actions would have upon nature. And as a conclusion, I can say that through EcoGothic, we are able to identify the excess, question binaries like nature and culture, or human and nature, and explore the chaos that surrounds us in the hope of being aware of our own limitations. So the frontier have always represented a vast and unknown expanse of land that was seen as both a challenge and an opportunity for American settlers. In EcoGothic, by coming across the uncanny in the middle of the ocean, can highlight the ways in which the natural world can challenge our understanding of reality and our place in it. The frontier can be depicted as a place of conflict in EcoGothic, where different ideologies and values collide. Therefore, it can be a site of tension between those who seek to exploit the natural world for profit or progress and those who seek to protect and preserve it. And the veil symbolizes the collective and individual pain and trauma that have been carried through the ages, manifested in its great white form. So the veil is kind of a microcosm of American civilization. And one of the things that is fascinating is that Melville is keenly aware that the dirty work of Western civilization and the way it is self-destructive. Maybe that is why in the end, Ishmael is the only survivor. Ishmael, as we know, is the narrator of Moby Dick, and his perspective serves as a lens through which readers experience the events of the story. So in terms of EcoGothic, Ishmael's role as a narrator is important because it allows readers to see how the characters interact with and understand the natural world around them. So.
The topic of fate is central in Moby Dick. While most attention in this matter is drawn to Ahab and Ishmael, I will look at Stubb in this regard. The second mate of the Pequod often gets overlooked when Moby Dick is analyzed, which is surprising when you consider that 4 chapters carry his name in the title, only second to Ahab. In the scholarly literature where Stubb is considered worth looking at, his character is either portrayed as mainly serving a functional purpose for humor in the book, or he gets criticized for his alleged cowardice towards Ahab, his apparently simple character, and his interactions with Pip and Fleece the cook. Only Alan Dagowitz considers Stubb a wise man. I agree with him and try to argue that the judgment and non-consideration by other scholarly critics of Stubb is unjustified. I will try to answer the question how Stubb handles his fate and whether this is understandable. In order to do that, I go through his most prominent character traits. First, I will tackle his fatalistic view on life, how it shows and what consequences this has on himself and others. Then I will look at the probably most outstanding character trait of his humor. Apart from being funny, Stubb's humor has a functional component to it as well, as it supports his style of leadership as a whaler. The less intuitive character trait I want to shed light on is his openness to others and other ideas. As a last point, I want to draw attention to Stubb's limited range of agency and in the end draw a conclusion on the given points. As already said, Stubb can be seen as a fatalist. In philosophy, the term fatalism is usually used to refer to the view that we are powerless to do anything other than what we actually do. This, of course, has implications on the agency of a person as it denies free will. But what impact does fatalism have as an individual's belief? Drawing on policy research from Tom Entwistle, we can discover 3 forms of applied fatalism: passive fatalism, protective fatalism, and pathological fatalism. Passive fatalism comes closest to the philosophical understanding, as these fatalists doubt their agency and respond to the challenge facing them with passivity or denial. protective fatalism can origin from acknowledging the facticity of randomness, constraint, and complexity. Protective fatalists are able to bracket out things they cannot, or at least think cannot influence, and focus on what they can influence and achieve. Thus, this form of fatalism allows for agency in a limited range. Another form of fatalism that unleashes agency is pathological fatalism. In this form, however, the symbolic assertion of free will can lead to self-harming or immoral behavior out of despair over apparent powerlessness. I argue that Stubb can be seen as a protective fatalist. This is observable in the wailing scenes throughout the book, when it seems like Stubb is not frightened of the accompanying dangers at all. Furthermore, in chapter 38, he expresses it himself. Haha's the final consequence. Why so? Because a laugh is the wisest, easiest answer to all that's queer. And come what will, one comfort's always left, that unfailing comfort is, it's all predestined. This shows that he accepts his fate, but still leaves himself room for agency in a limited framework. He might not be able to change the bigger picture, but he still has some agency, which becomes evident in his good leadership for the crew and his enjoyment of everyday goods. One might also argue the other way around and think of Stubb as a pathological fatalist, considering his self-harming habit of constantly smoking his pipe. His fearless character when it comes to encounters with whales could also point in the direction of self-destructive behavior. But then again, one needs to reconsider the situation he is in. It is not the case that Stubb carelessly attacks whales regardless of the consequences. Instead, his fearlessness is one of the attributes that make him an excellent whaler and can be seen as an act of protection. Constantly smoking his pipe might indeed not be good for his health. However, this should also be put in context. On one hand, the side effects of tobacco were not that well known in the 18th century. And on the other hand, we know how the story ends. So let the man have his pipe. Stubb's protective fatalism also shapes the probably most distinct feature of his character, his humor. Not only from an outside perspective, but also from Stubb personally, the importance of humor for his character is shown in the passage earlier from chapter 39. Still, it can be felt in many more passages throughout the novel. It helps him to be well liked on the ship, but also to cope with the dangers of a whaling journey. Furthermore, it shapes his leading style as the second officer. In his fatalistic view, destiny cannot be changed, and if this is true, then the smart thing to do is to just laugh it off. He stresses this once more in chapter 39 by saying, "I know not all that may be coming, but be it what it will, I'll go to it laughing." Stubb combines protective fatalism and humor to create his life philosophy. His humor also serves as a coping mechanism, as he admits in chapter 119. When confronted by a Starbuck that he should stop his singing and behave like a brave man, Stubb tells him this. "I am not a brave man, never said I was a brave man. I am a coward and I sing to keep up my spirits." One could argue that Stubb is being ironic in this situation, especially since in the next sentence he jokingly says that the only way to stop him from singing is to cut his throat. However, I would argue that although he certainly is trying to be funny by over-exaggerating, there's a grain of truth in every joke, and his jokes are a form of dealing with his underlying fears. As the second mate of the Pequod, Stubb is responsible for one of the whaling boats and the crew on it. In his role as an officer, his life philosophy once more becomes apparent. In chapter 48, the first lowering, Stubb's unique style of leadership is visible for the first time. And who better to describe it than Ishmael? He would say the most terrific things to his crew in a tone so strangely compounded of fun and fury, and the fury seemed so calculated merely as a spice to the fun, that no oarsman could hear such queer invocations without pulling for dear life, and yet pulling for the mere joke of the thing. Besides, he all the time looked so easy and indolent himself, so loungingly managed his steering oar, and so broadly gaped, open-mouthed at times, that the mere sight of such a yawning commander, by sheer force of contrast, acted like a charm upon the crew. This passage shows how well Stubb masters the balance act between keeping his men focused and motivated and not giving fear too much room on the boat so that the sailors might get petrified. That helps for the purpose of whaling, of course, but also shows that he cares about his crew. That Stubb cares about the well-being of his comrades can also be seen in chapter 72, The Monkey Rope. In this chapter, Queequeg has the ungrateful task of swimming in a swarm of sharks in order to attach the blubber hook to the whale. After he finally climbs back on the ship, completely exhausted and undercooled, the steward provides him with a beverage that, to put mildly, does not generate a lot of enthusiasm in Stubb. Ginger, Ginger, and will you have the goodness to tell me, Mr. Doughboy, where lies the virtue of ginger? Ginger, is ginger the sort of fuel you use, Doughboy, to kindle a fire in this shivering cannibal? Ginger, what the devil is ginger? Stubb stands in for Queequeg and makes sure that he gets something sensible to drink. That means, in this case, alcohol. This is by no means self-evident, because giving Queequeg, who is a harpooner, the good stuff would normally not necessarily be considered. Still, Stubb takes care of him and thereby shows his openness to others. Throughout the novel, Stubb is the character most involved with marginalized crew members who are ignored by most other characters on the ship. Even though Stubb's scenes with Pip in chapter 93, The Castaway, and Fleece the Cook in chapter 64, Stubb's Supper, are hard to read for modern day eyes because Stubb is reproducing racist resentments, as we also saw in Delara's presentation, I still argue that Stubb is open to others and other ideas. In the literature, Stubb gets criticized for leaving Pip in open water and is made responsible for Pip's mental downfall. I disagree with this accusation. When Pip jumps the second time, Stubb relies on the other boats in vicinity to pick up Pip and goes after the whale. Unfortunately, this does not happen. Pip is left alone in the sea and goes insane. But is it Stubb's fault? Maybe partly. But even Ishmael says it. For the rest, blame not Stubb too hardly. The thing is common in that fishery. Instead, following Dargowitz's argumentation, Stubb's decision to rescue Pip the first time he jumps off the boat is the more exceptional action. It can be seen as an act of openness and kindness that others maybe would not have done on a whaling journey. The racist comparison of Pip's value in contrast to the value of a whale, which Stubb uses when he tells Pip not to jump off the boat again, and the chapter with Fleece should be viewed upon in the context of an 18th century whaling journey. Both scenes function as pointed criticism of objectification and the racial politics of the time. Stubb, as a member of the fishery and thus of the world, is complicit in these evils. Criticizing him over anyone else for such complicity, however, is unjustified. In the last step, I want to investigate Stubb's lack of agency when it comes to preventing the Pequod's disastrous confrontation with Moby Dick. It would be easy to criticize that Stubb does not take any actions in this regard. However, considering his protective fatalism, it is understandable that he does not do anything. If you do not believe that your actions can avert the catastrophe, then why risk an altercation with monomaniac Ahab? Maybe it is just a rational thing to do because apart from Starbuck, the other men are completely obedient to Ahab, as their fear of Ahab was greater than their fear of fate, as it says in the book. Even though Stubb is well liked and respected on the ship, the crew follows Ahab. A mutiny or comparable actions to stop Ahab are thus impossible. So even if Stubb wanted to take action in order to save the Pequod from meeting Moby Dick and getting destroyed, there's nothing he can do about it. To conclude, Stubb's way of life is shaped by his life philosophy of protective fatalism, which he combines with a strong sense of humor. This limits his agency concerning the tragic ending of the Pequod. Still, he has agency in a limited framework, which he uses well. He is a good leader for his crew and stays open to others. His inaction regarding Ahab's vendetta against Moby Dick may be criticized, but if you do not believe that you can influence the way the world goes, then why would you try? Furthermore, analyzing the situation on the ship, Stubb is indeed not in the position to do something about the mad plan of Ahab. Therefore, I argue that Stubb's way of life is understandable. Whether it is undesirable or not, however, cannot be answered objectively, but depends on subjective beliefs on fate and agency.
So initially I thought about making visual representations, but then I thought about perhaps focusing on film studies in order to be more mindful of the time. So my subject is when the light gazes, Moby Dick's gaze in visual representations as conscious and sublime. So when one thinks about Moby Dick, the whiteness of the whale, its massive scale, and its bruised, experienced body are the most distinct features that come to mind. However, in films, the eyes and the gaze of Moby Dick are also highlighted as much as the whale's color, size, or experience. And in Moby Dick, the two most important organs of the whale's head are explained as ears and eyes. Melville declares the whale's eyes as a marvelous mystery when compared to humans' ability to see mechanically and involuntarily with open eyes, and being able to focus on one object when it is compared to whales' ability to see two distinct visions of opposite directions. Melville's Leviathan is wise, sublime, and dangerous, and the chapter The Chase, Birthday, proves to the reader that the whale is aware of humans' presence when it attacks them deliberately. In this talk, I will discuss that although the reader does not get access to Moby Dick's perspective in the novel, the visual adaptations and representations of Moby Dick display Moby Dick's gaze as a symbol of its animal consciousness, distinctiveness, and sublime nature. Jonathan Burt explains in his book, Animals in Film, that in films, animal imagery has a, I quote, rupturing effect, both in terms of the way it avoidably points beyond itself to wider issues and in its capacity to resist or to problematize its own meaning on screen. End of quote. Burt suggests as a medium of representation in modernity, films are both formed of those things which are seen responsible for the alienation of humans and animals from nature by reproducing images that substitute for the quote-unquote real world. However, Burt also notes that film has the ability to reassert the moral importance of the bonds between humans and animals. Therefore, it is important to see film and visual representations of Moby Dick as productions that substitute a real bond between humans and animals, as well as reminding the importance of the human-nature bond. Films that I will discuss during this talk use various techniques to promote the representation of the white whale as a sublime, distinct animal, and as an animal that possesses a consciousness that is othering the human consciousness. John Huston's Moby Dick and a more recent adaptation of the story of the ship Essex that inspired Melville, In the Heart of the Sea, directed by Ron Howard, uses scenes of close-ups of the whale's eyes and the gaze of the whale to indicate the distinctiveness, conscious, and sublime nature of Moby Dick. Close-up is defined as a camera shot technique taken at a short range. These are some examples of close-up from both films. These shots provide the audience with a detailed portrayal of what is happening on a small scale, and close-ups are frequently used to bring the attention of the audience to a certain detail or facial expressions of the characters. In both Moby Dick and In the Heart of the Sea, there are several scenes including close-ups on whales' eyes. However, it is important to note that these close-ups of other whales differ from the close-ups of Moby Dick's eyes, as the gaze plays an important role building the meaning, and the audience is only provided with Moby Dick's and the white whale's gazes afterward. The gaze in cinema is closely connected to the audience's engagement with the film. In the article, The Real Gaze, Todd McGovern suggests that the subject cannot directly capture the gaze. However, fantasy, which he defines in a broader sense of imaginary scenarios filling the gaps with an ideology, offers the subject a way out of this dilemma. According to him, works of art turn private fantasies into public ones and respond to shared forms of dissatisfaction and thus appeal to wider audience. Just as in other films, in Moby Dick and In the Heart of the Sea, the audience is looking at fantasy through different perspectives. For most of the part of the films, the audience's gaze is similar to those of whalers. The characters that are followed throughout the film are Ishmael and Ahab for Moby Dick, whereas it is Owen Chase and Thomas Nickerson for In the Heart of the Sea. Additionally, the audience's gaze is similar to those of whalers in the sense of spending little time on land, witnessing the conflicts during the journey, and spotting whales from afar. However, the audience's gaze as a whaler disrupts during the chase scenes of Moby Dick, which does not happen with the other whales. When the audience sees a close-up of a whale's eye gazing at humans, what the whale is looking at is provided with the next shot. For instance, in Houston's Moby Dick attacks and breaks Ahab's boat. Shots of different angles follow. So one is a medium shot of a whaler jumping from the boat, and another is a close-up of seeing Ahab fall, which could be Moby Dick's gaze. Eyeline match cuts display the whalers and what they're looking at. Ahab is climbing onto Moby Dick to attempt to kill Moby Dick, and I hope you can see it because the top for me is like zoom. Okay. Ahab is climbing onto Moby Dick to kill Moby Dick, and as Moby Dick swims further away from the whalers, longer shots of whalers' gaze replace the previous shots, implying that the whalers are waiting and they cannot see what is going on. This high-angle close-up shot, which is taken from a different angle, here, if I turn this off, yes, different angle than the others. This displays perhaps it's not the whaler's gaze, and it displays Ahab from above, holding onto ropes to climb higher, followed by another close-up of Moby Dick's eye, turning towards the action. Although this shot and the other following shots of Ahab stabbing Moby Dick do not exactly correspond to Moby Dick's perspective, they are positioned at a better angle for the audience to provide a better view of what the whale is looking at. And a similar but more direct version of the animal's gaze is visible in the heart of the sea. Stranded on two boats with little to fight against, the remaining whalers on boats notice the white whale, which is a representation of Moby Dick, appear again. First mate of the crew, Owen Chase, holds a harpoon, waiting for the whale to approach. And a close-up of following the whale's eye is provided as the whale's body moves in the water. And with the next shot, the camera gets in and out of the water. So we can see it in this way. I only took 2 shots here, but there are more. The audience's gaze returns to Owen Chase and what he's looking at. But shortly after, as he raises the harpoon while watching the whale move, the white whale slowly raises from the water, the eye of the whale gazing back at him, both while providing short reverse shots of the animal and human's eyes, as well as a shot coming out of the sea with blurred vision of Owen Chase. And this is a bit more clear version. With this short scene, the audience's perspective not only sees where the whale is gazing, but also sees another shot of the same scene, specifically taken from the whale's eyes. The lighting gazes back, and the audience's identity as a whaler is distorted for a moment when they witness the returning gaze of the whale. In that sense, Moby Dick is different from the other whales because the audience can see Moby Dick's gaze reacting to the whalers, and the whale is so powerful that it affects the film the audience is watching. Jonathan Bird discusses the look between animals and humans in films. According to him, the animal's eye is a very important motive, and what this motive invokes by displaying this type of contact should be questioned. According to him, the exchange of a look is, as I quote, the basis of a social contract in the absence of possibility of language, end quote. However, he notes that critics also argue that the animal gaze is a theme of fragmentation that dominates over the theme of bonding. In Moby Dick and in the Heart of the Sea, when Ahab and Owen Chase look at the whale's returning gaze indicates a communication between them. It is important to note that this communication is only identified as a communication or a language by the human side. In Why Look at Animals, John Berger explains that the look of an animal is indifferent to humans. However, the animal's look will be recognized only by the human's look, as humans become aware of themselves returning the look. In the mentioned scene of In the Heart of the Sea, while holding the harpoon and looking at the whale's eye, Owen Chase becomes aware of himself. Different from the experience of Captain Pollard, who continuously tells Owen Chase to attack the whale from the other boat, when the whale gazes back at Owen Chase, he stops, realizing something that is not explained to the audience through words. He is in the middle of the sea with a tool to hunt in his hand and looking at a sea animal that is bigger than him. The character fails to attack the animal. Whether it is fear or the realization that his attempt of killing the whale will be in vain, he is affected by the look of the whale, realizing the sublime nature of the animal. A romantic scene of turned against silhouettes looking toward the massive tail of a whale in the middle of the sea continues, and the film characterizes the white whale as a mysterious, destructive, untamable, sublime creature. Moby Dick returns the gaze. However, similar to the other whales' portrayal, his consciousness in the films Moby Dick and In the Heart of the Sea are not portrayed as a consciousness in the sense that it's possessed by humans. It is the human gaze that adds meaning to Moby Dick's gaze. Burt explains that the capacity of language marks the difference between humans and animals, and notes that, as I quote, "Just as some writers consider that our look toward animal can only ever be narcissistic, so does others consider it to be impossible to interpret the look of the animal back at us." Regardless of how Moby Dick's returning gaze and attack towards the ship, as well as the white whale's gaze toward the weakened whalers on the boat, imply a communication or a conscious reaction, in both of the films, it is only implied that Moby Dick is reacting consciously as a creature different than an animal, but it is not shown nor proven. Very short shots providing the whale's gaze do not convey special meaning and remain as the animal gaze, and the audience does not lose their whaler, hunter, or human perspective for the most of the parts of Moby Dick and In the Heart of the Sea. The spectator's gaze for the most part of the Moby Dick and In the Heart of the Sea identifies as human, hunter, and whaler's gaze, and seeing Moby Dick is an important part for the both of the films. In Huston's Moby Dick, a scene representing the events taking place in the chapter Quarterdeck displays Ahab's determination of finding Moby Dick, as he announces to the crew that whoever sees the white whale will be awarded. In Ron Howard's In the Heart of the Sea, after seeing the land on their 34th day of being stranded, Owen Chase notices the white whale in the sea, unlike the other members who are in the boat and also disagree with them. He sees the whale and he shouts, "He has been following us." After telling his story In the Heart of the Sea, Thomas Nickerson tells Herman Melville that Captain Pollard sailed again and sought the white whale. Jonathan Burt analyzes the film Moby Dick in Animals in Film, and in his words, I quote, "The obsession with needing to see the white whale, one that is different from all other whales, means that the most visible whale is the most important whale. To catch him, Ahab needs to predict where Moby Dick will be. Ahab's eyes are open perpetually. He does not sleep." End of quote. The urge of seeing the white whale for Burt is an urge to identify with the animal. However, as Burt suggests, the impossibility of truly achieving such kind of identification results in demise. Films parallel with the novel in terms of displaying Moby Dick's indifference to the distinct way he is identified with. He is the distinct white whale that will be named Moby Dick in the character Melville's novel In the Heart of the Sea, whereas he's already an infamous creature for the whalers in the film Moby Dick, being sought because it is considered different by humans. To conclude, in the films Moby Dick and In the Heart of the Sea, the gaze of the white whale was used as a technique of displaying Moby Dick as a sublime creature, its distinctiveness as well as its animal consciousness. Filmmakers distort the audience's gaze of a whaler with Moby Dick's gaze, and hence invite the audience to identify with Moby Dick as a distinct, conscious and sublime creature, and attribute meanings when the Leviathan gazes, while it is the filmmakers creating the gaze as well as the audience interpreting what it means. I would like to end my words with John Huston's biography written by Axel Madsen, as he writes, I quote, "Moby Dick was a symbol of evil and Captain Ahab's fight with the Leviathan, a Promethean struggle with evil. Or the whale was goodness, and Ahab, with his insane pride and crazed passion for revenge, was evil." End of quote. Thank you for listening.
We are going to listen to a bunch of music today, so I prefer if you just set your volume of the computers. And well, you can see here, and I want to mention that throughout my slideshow, I have used an artificial intelligence, and I've written some paragraphs to describe the scenery. So most of the paintings here are AI, and some of the photos are taken by me. And but I'm going to give you the info, the table of contents here. It's going to be very basic. I'm going to depend mainly on the songs, and I'm going to begin. I want to begin with Mastodon's Blood and Thunder song, and I would love you to just listen and see if you can hear the rage here. I don't know if you can hear it now. I'm going to start. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Yes.
No, I'm not.
Okay. Then.
I'm not hearing this, but I think the problem's on me then.
If you can hear the song, then we will continue.
Yes, right now it's fine. I think I managed it. Yes.
Right. I'll put on the lyrics here too. And it keeps on going, saying, "White veil, the holy grail, white veil, the holy grail." And I want to mention that the song here is portrayed by Ayeb's perspective of the white whale, and I feel like the words are not enough to describe, so I depended mainly on the riffs here, and we can see how the sea actually breaks his reality, the idea of reality for him. He keeps on going on saying the white whale is the holy grail for him, and throughout the novel, actually, we are left with this idea. And I would like to continue with the sea topic here, and of course in the music genre, on the rock music genre actually, in which I have taken some examples. The sea here it's great and vast, and somehow it relates to the idea that there is no road there, there is no route that they can follow. As a landsman and a seaman, the people tend to follow some lines, some route, but I don't know if you have checked with the routes on the sea, that of course not the traveling type. There is no route, and you can make your own. And throughout the novel, it's described, and the novel does in fact give the idea that on the sea they are not alone, and throughout the chapters they are left with the animals and they hunt down the whales, but they do not, the characters do not simply think of what the animals might feel or see. This actually gives us a brief idea of Emersonian approach to nature, and I think that in this particular novel, the nature is just a caregiver in this sense, and we are the whalers are just taking advantage as long as they do. And But throughout the chapters, as I have mentioned before, the seagulls, especially the seagulls, although in hunting, the seagulls actually point out to your prayer, they could help you reach out. But throughout the novel, Ishmael and especially Starbuck feels that the seagulls on high above, they just depress them, and they do not simply understand the meaning of it. And the natural event, as might be concluded on the sea, is that we cannot just see under it, and the terrors it hides are just they just give us the madness, as Pip has experienced. I'm going to quote from the Brit chapter here, and it says, "Consider the subtleness of the sea, how its most dreaded creatures glide underwater, unapparent for the most part, and treacherously hidden beneath the lowliest tints of azure. Consider also the devilish brilliance and beauty of many of its most remotest stripes, as the dainty embellished shape of many species of sharks. Consider once more the universal cannibalism of the sea, all whose creatures prey upon each other, preying on eternal war since the world began. Consider all this, and then turn to the green, gentle, and most docile earth. Consider them both, the sea and the land. And do you not find a strange analogy to something in yourself, for as this appalling ocean surrounds the world and the land, so in the soul of man there lies on insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all the horrors of half-known life. God keep thee, push not up from that isle, you cannot never return." Well, it's been actually very describing for me, and I'm going to continue with two pictures here, and they are made by the AI again. On the up left, up right, you could see the whale as if a sphinx, and on the below, you could see Ahab, and it kind of has a foot by the whale, in which we can find ourselves in the chapter the Sphinx. As we know, in the Sphinx chapter, the Captain Ahab actually talks to the beheaded whale, and he keeps on saying that of all the divers, you have dived the deepest. And I grew up with rock music, and I read that, it just bring me the idea of the whole diver by Dio, and I keep on suggesting the same idea, and he rather wants the secrets. Ahab wants to know what he hides, and he actually, in a way, brings him to a holy ground, but he's now just standing there as if some sphinx or some monumental like Ozymandias, and he puts on himself as if the godly man that is just taken care of what the Sphinx was, and he puts himself on some new level in that sense, and he cannot see the nature through his eyes, and he wants to see the nature through whale's eyes, and he just keeps on talking on what he can maybe see, and it's I'm moved by this chapter actually, and it's just his I would say ideal. It's his some sort of lethal joy, I could say, that will bring him to despair. And I'm going to continue with The Whole Diver by Dio and his statement about this, and we're going to listen a little bit of that. And he says on the report that the whole diver is a Christ-like figure, a prophet who has sacrificed himself for the sins of others. But this takes place in a different world, a different planet, and the prophet is bound to dive off his world. But the people on this planet, simmering us as humanity, say, "Don't go, they'll kill you." Just as if the Brit chapter. And what they're really saying is, hey, we are all selfish people. And I would like to I would love to listen to a bit of the song. I'm sorry, you cannot hear listen to the whole song. And it begins with an eerie beginning, like some siren or some wailing sound, and you could see the lyrics there too. I would love to give you the brief info about. So the album cover here is drawn by his wife actually, and there's a rabbi and a devilish monster chaining and probably hurting the rabbi, and it gives me a brief idea that the reality could be broken again. The reality could be underlined again. Maybe the rabbi is not afraid. Maybe the rabbi is suffering. But the idea here is that the sea here, the painting here is just left motion, which brings me the idea of the spotter in when Ishmael describes scenery. And of course, I would love to get to the most famous, one of the most famous paintings here too. It's the Watson and the Shark, and it gives me the same idea. There is this shark figure, and there's this evilish figure, and they seem to be hurting. They seem to be taking revenge from the hunters or the anything that is holy could be mentioned. And the real there's no reality beyond it. Only we can just see and maybe grasp what we are left with. And the definition made by Ishmael, I feel, fit the most works. And what the most puzzled and confounded you was a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering at the center of the picture over three blue, dim, perpendicular lines floating in a nameless east. A boggy, soggy, scoochy picture, truly enough to drive a nervous man distracted. Yet was there a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that fairly froze you to it, till you involuntarily took a note of yourself to find out what that marvelous painting meant. I feel the quote here by Ishmael can be applicable to the album cover here, and the Watson and the Shark here, and the AI, I feel. And I would love to give some take some minute to the pictures here. The two on the left are taken by me, and on the right I have shown you before. It's made by AI, and I feel, of course, they are off the coast of Izmir near Greece, and I do know that there's a land. But imagine there is no land you see, and there is no border you can feel that you can get help from. And I feel this is what Ahab is traumatized with. There is no hope for him. There is no safe place. Although he mentions he had a wife and child, but they are at the land and he is far from it. And this is what brings me to the idea of the whole diver here. He wants to get to the asset why this creature is in trust and in a noble way. I'd love to continue with the sea here, and I just love the picture here. It's made by AI again, and it was clear in Ahab's mind that the sea was blurry. Before talking to the head, he once tried to know the secrets through the minds of refiners of knowledge. But the idea here is the all the ideas, all the truth that could be said about the sea was made by lens people. They do not have the experience as of Ahab or any other captain there. And the whale, on the other hand, just dies enough to find what is maybe true. And chapter 30, the pipe, in correspondence, I would say, Ahab throws the pipe he has onto the sea, and it may remind the whale or anything. As I have mentioned before, the problem here, the idea here is that the reality is bent for Ahab, and he cannot think straight. He is kind of wavy in a way, and he cannot make up his mind. Thus, throws the pipe away. Maybe the pipe was not what he wanted to get as of Moby Dick there. And the next song is the Ghost of a Navigator by the Iron Maiden. And I would love to give you the picture here. It's a Patrón dos Instrumentos, and it's a monument for the I would say the navigators here. And there's this idea of the navigators that they have this feeling of discovering. They have this feeling that to continue no matter what they see or no matter how harsh the situations are. And Ahab, in this sense, I think he does have this past idea. I think he does have the knowledge, but he prefers not to see it. And I'm going to leave you alone for a minute with the Ghost of a Navigator by Iron Maiden. Well, it has a minute-long intro, but I'm going to continue with that, and then we're going to get with the lyrics. As the song suggests, actually, there is this person who has a strong will that cannot be led astray. This reminds me of Ahab and how far he's going to go for it. And we could actually state that the lines, he will go west in the Iron Maiden song. We could say that he is going to die. We could say that the beginning of life could be made by the east and the end of life could be the west. Maybe we could just foreshadow what's going to happen here. And the persona in the song is I'll say a materialistic person, and he does not simply just let go of what he can get. And this could be experience, this could be some sort of way that he could get, or this could rather be some sort of dream, I could say. And what I'm going to say here is that the ghost of the navigators lead him. Ishmael begins the novel with some sort of coldness, some sort of soul leading him to it. I'm going to ask you this question, maybe if he could be maybe led by some ghost of a navigator. Is he a navigator? Or Ahab, is he a navigator? I'm going to leave this to Q&A session. And as I have mentioned here, the sea breaks the reality again. And the Starbuck can see it as somehow materialistic beauty, or Ishmael just sees it as an experience, and or Ahab here sees the sea as a home of the white whale. And Ahab sees the terror he has faced before. He has been struck by the whale once. And the Ishmael, of course, has this glimpse of fate on the sea. And I would like to get to the idea of the sea as somehow a parent to animals, as in the Brit chapter or some other chapters as of epilogue. But I'd love to talk about the Pip story. And in his experience, Pip was drawn into the sea, and once the little boy was back on the board, he was struck. He was maybe could be mentioned as mad, and maybe Ahab has some has the idea of Pip. Maybe we can see in the novel that he has this traumatic effect of it, and Ahab has survived. Thus, I would love to say that he has survived, but at what cost? He has survived the one of the most terrible event, and we could see a broken character there. No matter how far we can take him to somehow mindset person that is not of any other thought, there is this broken side of him. There's this left out side of him, and both the whale, the Moby Dick, white whale, and Ahab, they seem to have a lot in common in that sense. We could say the white whale as some sort of a return of the oppressed kind of a deal, but we could also say that it is just an animal. Or Ahab in this case, we could say he is as quote unquote ungodly man, or we could say just a broken persona here. And in the epilogue chapter again, I'd love to talk about how the idea of the children of the sea is mentioned, and the song here, "Children of the Sea" by Black Sabbath. We could say Pip has become a children of the sea. You could say Ahab has become a children of the sea, and of course the whales are children of the sea. And we could probably say that the song and the novel in here, they bring about I would say a resolution. In the epilogue chapter, Ishmael is picked up by the boat Rachel. Of course, it's a biblical allusion to the story of Rachel, and it is some sort of a, maybe I'll say resemblance in that sense. So we are going to listen to the "Children of the Sea" by Black Sabbath, and the song here, the artist actually has formally mentioned that the idea here with we sailed across the air before we learned to fly. We thought it could never end. It's an ecocratic statement about the world and everything, but we could maybe adapt it to the idea of becoming the children of the sea, as of the story of Ishmael. And I'd love to just listen to a bit of it with you. And it keeps on going on. And the very idea of my presentation here is there are three personas with the songs of the Whole Diver and the Ghost of Navigator and the Children of the Sea. They can be easily adapted to the novel, to the characters here. And I feel there's this close feeling that I get with the songs and the novel. And throughout the Children of the Sea song, the persona says that we are just born to lose, and we are actually the humanity here is not simply aware of what the outcomes of their actions could get to. In this case, Ahab's ship quad is struck by the whale. We could say there's this white whale that struck the Pequot, but it could be easily taken into another account that the word there, the society there is just struck by the nature. And it gives the idea that the songs and the novel here, they do not have to be closely linked. I think you could hear the lyrics when reading the novel. And in the epilogue chapter again, we are left with just one person that has the story to tell us, and it is Ishmael. And I feel the same terror Ishmael has contracted somehow closely linked with Pip and the Ahab's circumstance. And it gives us the idea that the reality in the whole novel is bent, just like the songs here. And well, we could hear, I think, with the novel and the song here, that there's this idea of an animal, there's this idea of a person, and there's this idea of a setting, that all the people are against each other, or all the living things are against each other, as long as they are troubled with them. And to conclude, actually, I'm going to read the whole part. To sum up, the sea has long been associated with mystery and concealment of fears, the collective unconscious, and wholeness throughout the history of societies and art. Captain Ahab cries out lyrics that are similar to the metal song Hole Diver by the 90s rock band and the books The Sphinx, which has the same subject. Additionally, Ghost of the Navigator by Iron Maiden and Children of the Sea by Black Sabbath both feature grotesque imagery similar to the Pickle ship and the subject Moby Dick, advocated for Macedon's album as well. Main themes for the holy and terrifying culture of the sea as it is perceived by Western art are the feeling of accepting a specific destiny, as could be seen by the Ghost of the Navigator, and sailing within and for the uncertainty of beyond time, as could be seen with the Children of the Sea, and sailing within and for the uncertainty beyond time, and have the music genre affects this particular mystic experience on sea. The characters and the narrative strategies used in aforementioned works share similar perspective, and Ishmael's experience may be referred as a decision maker and is accepted throughout the works. To sum up, it cannot be separated that literature and music have such a significant impact on how humans perceive the power of art, thus, I think, the reality. Well, thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing the songs with me. You're muted.
I'm sorry. So I actually, again, I have always had a great appreciation for arts, and the way that you have pointed out that intersectionality and have really brought a fresh visage to the subject was really impressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to give you some pictures, photos taken by me. And those are the photos from my experience. And it's off the coast of Izmir. And this is off the coast of Matosinhos in Portugal. And I want to ask a question to the people here. What we do see here, does it remind you of? Does it maybe, can it sing your song? And that will be all.
Herman Melville's Moby Dick is an epic tale of monomanic obsession, friendship, and camaraderie whose motifs and symbols of the great white whale are still referenced in contemporary media, popular culture, and literature today. The original novel can be hard to access for younger audiences, specifically due to Melville's unique writing style, the switch between different literary modes, and the intense focus on whaling, as well as the novel's grandiose scale. Adaptations can grant easy access to general readership as well as first-time readers of English and American classics. Therefore, I want to examine how a successful adaptation can be made possible and explore how well the source text adapts into different literary media geared towards a younger readership. In this paper, I will define the key concept of adaptations as a process of translation. By looking at two particular adaptations of Moby Dick for younger audiences, I will show a variety in, in creativity in their approach to Melville's 500-page classic. I will discuss a short children's book designed specifically for first-time readers, as well as a graphic novel that caters to an older teenage audience and includes full illustrations of the novel's events in detail. These translated adaptations will then be analyzed more in depth and compared to one another. Their deviations from Melville's novel will also be discussed. Editions of Moby Dick adapted for younger audiences not only deal with issues of translation, both on a literary and cultural level, but also with issues of mediation. How does one faithfully adapt themes of religion and paganism, of cannibalism and exoticism, as well as the copious and detailed descriptions of whale hunts and processing of a whale that make Melville's classic sound more like an encyclopedia at times, rather than a thrilling story-driven narrative? Which elements should be carried over when adapting, which elements should be omitted, and how does the focus shift when adapting for children specifically? Adaptation is part of translation, and as such is defined by Jeremy Mundy as the practice of transferring the meaning of a source text into the target text, while respecting the original intent and providing an equivalency in meaning. While an equivalency in meaning refers more to the practice of a target-bound translation that respects the original intent of the source text and transfers meaning accordingly, a closer, more source-bound translation is also possible, though not a common practice, when adapting on top of translating, since it greatly limits elements of artistic expression and opportunities of omission or additions to the target text. Though the two novels I brought with me today, both are also translated into German, this will not be the focus of this analysis, but as an overall issue of translation, the adaptation process can be best explained using these processes as rudimentary foundations. So just that you guys know, these novels were translated into German. A source-bound translation, a literal word-for-word translation, must remain as close to the source text as possible, while still being comprehensible in the target language. This approach also encompasses the stylistic qualities of a text, that being a poem or a song written in stanzas, means that it should keep these qualities in the translated version as well. The overall goal and aim of a source-bound translation is to preserve the linguistic qualities of a source text for the target language audiences, to comprehend and appreciate them, and also to analyze them further. A target-bound translation, on the other hand, or a free sense for sense translation, allows for every quality except for the content of the source text to be changed to make it sound as genuine as possible in the target language. It should be written in a way that already resembles the appearance of a source text. A translator can then choose to replicate idioms with ones that suit the target language in style and lexical quality. Sentence structure, word and punctuation choices can be changed as well as the stylistic qualities of a text. The overall goal and aim of a target-bound translation is to adapt to the target languages and readers' linguistic and cultural specificities as seamlessly as possible, producing a text that sounds and looks as authentic as possible. While looking at adaptation as an issue of translation, a distinction between adaptation across different media and across different literary genres for different audiences must first be established. As defined by Mundy, an adaptation of a source text into a different literary mode of the same language is considered intralingual, that being a children's rendition of an encyclopedia, and cultural values and symbols and idioms of the source culture, or making the choice to transfer meaning to an equivalent aspect of the target culture, which concerns issues of domestication and foreignization, that being transferring the cultural meaning for a target audience proper, or maintaining some of the cultural specific elements of the source text, since the adaptation respects the original intent and does not aim to dismiss these unique features of the source text. The adaptation process must also concern itself with the question of necessity. Is it necessary to adapt to the target culture fully, or will the product be more authentic if certain elements remain unchanged? In this case, transferring from the American culture to German culture. Therefore, the following question must be raised. What is adaptation? Is it a kind of translation at all, or is it something entirely different? An adaptation in the classical sense refers to the transfer of meaning from one source medium to another target medium. This can include transfer from a written source to film, from film to play, from text to music, from music to film, and so on and so forth, while drawing on the field of semiotics, that being intersemiotic translations. All translation implies a degree of manipulation. The source text should be manipulated for a certain purpose. This concludes that translation concerns the level of meaning, while adaptation, on the other hand, seeks to transmit the purpose of the original text and attempts to spell out the intentions of the author. In the case of our novel, Moby Dick, being adapted to not just another literary mode, but also translated from the source language, English, into the target language, German, we must evaluate whether an adaptation into German culture is plausible and useful, or if the English language and the American cultural qualities should be maintained. Cross-cultural adaptation and translation negotiate their contents as issues of foreignization or domestication as relating to the target language and cultures, as well as the target audience of a text. Adapting Moby Dick for children can thus be a challenging task, as the original novel contains complex themes, mature language, and graphic descriptions of violence. However, these following criteria should be kept in mind when adapting for a younger audience. Simplifying your language. Melville's writing features complex vocabulary and sentence structure, which can be difficult for children to understand. An adaptation for children should simplify the language and use shorter sentences. Focusing on the adventure. Children are often drawn to stories with exciting adventures and daring heroes. An adaptation of Moby Dick for children could focus on the more exciting and dangerous aspects of the story, such as the games between the ships, the thrill of the whale hunts, and the final chase between the Pequod and the white whale in detail. Either focalizing primarily through Ishmael or Ahab, or neither of them could also be an option. Toning down violence. As the original novel contains graphic descriptions of violence and death, which may not be appropriate for young readers, an adaptation for children could tone down the violence and focus on the adventure and suspense of the story, given its target audience. Utilizing illustrations. Children's novels often include illustrations to help bring the story to life. An adaptation of Moby Dick for children could implement illustrations to help younger readers visualize the characters and events in the story. In the case of the graphic novel, this is executed in a way that focuses way more on the action on board the Pequod and omits educational discourse surrounding whales while portraying the whaling and hunting process in detail. So that's what you saw in this picture right here. Emphasizing the lessons. Moby Dick contains many lessons about the dangers of obsession, the importance of teamwork, and the power of nature. An adaptation for children could emphasize these lessons in a way that is accessible and age-appropriate. We will now briefly look at some of those choices and take a closer look at elements that got lost or changed in adaptation, starting off with our characters. In Melville's original, we follow a narrator as he arrives in the fishing town of New Bedford, seeking adventure on sea, introducing himself to the reader with one of literature's most quoted lines, "Call me Ishmael." This introduction serves as a clean slate for readers, as they can easily identify with Ishmael, as he might just as well be unnamed. Editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Moby Dick, Herschel Parker, comments on the protagonist's name in the annotations, stating that Ishmael refers to the biblical figure of the same name and illegitimate son of Abraham, who is the outcast personified. Melville makes multiple references to biblical stories and figures in his novel, such as the tale of Jonah being swallowed up by a great whale, calling the sperm whales leviathans on multiple occasions, and naming the novel's main protagonist Ahab after the deserted king and tragic king of the Bible, who led his people to ruin, much like the fictional Ahab led his crew of the Pequod to die in battle against Moby Dick. None of these two children's adaptations, however, emphasize these biblical connections, even though this would be a logical connection point for prioritizing educational aspects while adapting. Söller, who's the author of the children's novel you see on the screen right now, stays faithful to Melville's opening and imitates the original's tone authentically, with Ishmael finding his way to New Bedford, stating his intentions of going on a whale hunt and his longing connection to the sea. Target audience is directly addressed by Ishmael, maintaining a friendly and curious tone as the reader is taken on a brief excursion regarding whales and the different whale types. That's the slide that I showed you before. This brief intermission cleverly combines the copious chapters and heavily detailed descriptions of the inner and outer workings of a whale that often intimidate first readers of the classic. This approach is a clever example of choosing to significantly alter the tone and the informational density of a source text to cater to the target audience's needs and expectations, since these are probably children in the elementary school age. Zola's novel is also illustrated quite colorfully, which makes these passages more fun to read and easier to digest for younger children. Major deviations from the source text first appear when Ishmael meets his roommate, the savage cannibal Queequeg, who towers over him, carries a threatening-looking tomahawk, and is adorned in strange tattoos and scars, and described in the novel as having a face of a dark purplish-yellow color, here and there stuck over with large blackish-looking squares. Yes, it's just as I had thought, he is a terrible bedfellow. A comical situation in the original then leads these two dissimilar individuals to share the same bed for a night and sees them becoming fast friends not long after, despite their cultural differences and opposing religious views. Ishmael and Queequeg's relationship in the beginning of the novel is heavily queer-coded and suggestive of homoerotic tension, which are topics that require a careful assessment by a translator or adapter. Zola opted for exaggerating the humorous elements of the scene in the source text and adding to it by incorporating a moral message that Ishmael then directs to the reader by stating that sometimes we maybe should just put our differences aside and just enjoy human company. Translation and adaptation as an act of mediation can not only be seen in this short scene that emphasizes ethical values, which the original forgoes, but it can also be seen in major creative changes brought forth during the adaptation process. Children specifically might not necessarily need nor want to know what motivated Ishmael to go to New Bedford in the first place and what led him to join the Pequod as soon as they open their book, but would much rather be swept away into action immediately. After all, a big white whale and a sinking ship on the cover suggests as much. Ellery and Geoffrey mediated in favor of the target audience through a rearrangement of the story's opening and closing moments in order to provide the target readers with such a sweeping action. Their adaptation of the classic utilizes the literary mode of a graphic novel, which adds another visual element to the reading experience. The storyline is usually simplified, as the translator must decide what for him or her is the spine of the story and go all out for it. Characters and incidents are frequently embellished and interpreted differently. This includes shortening, stretching, and rearranging the story's events as to fit the target audience's needs. The graphic novel caters to a slightly older audience, presumably a teenage readership, and opens with a distressed, disheveled, half-dead Ishmael being rescued from the open sea, the sole survivor of the Pequod's faithful encounter with the white whale. The crew of the Rachel take him in and ask him to tell a story. This leads the confused Ishmael to ramble before he finally kicks the story off with his famous line, "Ich heiße Ishmael." While the graphic novel continues to stick to the plot of the original till it loops back to the opening at the end when Ishmael is seen drifting towards Rachel, the adaptation focuses more on the lonesomeness, the melancholic feeling, and gloomy atmosphere on board the Pequod. And finally, the graphic novel completely omits any educational content that the source text provided and chooses to focus more on the adventure at sea and Ahab's monomanic obsession with the whale. This choice reflects a target-bound approach that translates the source text's content in a sense-for-sense style and leaves room for creative freedom and rearrangement wherever necessary to create an authentic and comprehensive reading experience. Additionally, due to the added layer of a visual and textual mode, the translators can influence a reader's experience of the adaptation through illustrations which bring the story to life in a vibrant way. Issues of domestication and foreignization can be seen in the linguistic choices that both adaptations make. All the original English place names, the character names, and the ship names remain unchanged from the English originals. Extending beyond that, character backgrounds, race, and personal histories also remain mainly unchanged. Frankly, the tale of Moby Dick could hardly be adapted into German culture or language completely and fully without losing most of its original value, importance, and cultural significance as an all-American tale. While adapting classic literature for children into another target language and culture, it is thus important to consider the audience as a user group, cater to their needs and level of understanding, and clearly define the adaptation's purpose as a derivative from the original that either shifts focus or amplifies the source text's message and unique qualities. Overall, a successful adaptation of Moby Dick for children should simplify the language, focus on the adventure, tone down the violence, use illustrations, and emphasize the lessons of the story whenever possible. And I highly recommend to you guys to read one of those novels. That was so much fun.
First of all, I should tell the topic of my presentation. In this presentation, I would like to cover a much simpler topic than most of the people who were talking today and yesterday. I would like to make a modern analysis of the character Captain Ahab by looking from the medical perspective and connecting his obsession with Moby Dick and the phantoms that haunt him to his amputation and the phantom pain that he is experiencing. As the first part of my presentation, I would like to introduce what is the term phantom pain, or also known as phantom limb pain, means. Sorry. According to the Amputee Coalition Organization, phantom limb pain refers to ongoing painful sensation that seem to be coming from the part of the limb that is no longer there. The limb is gone, but the pain is real. Basically, it is a medical condition that people who had a certain type of amputation, whether it be an arm, a leg, or even some other smaller part like an eye, can feel. And the pain that they feel is similar to the pain that someone may feel when they have their arm burning, or they feel an electrical sense in their arm. However, that arm is no longer there. And the reason why I came with this presentation is because while reading Moby Dick, I noticed that our author chose to use the word phantom a lot, which of course all of us are being literature students. We can see the meaning and the importance when someone uses a word many times. The first chapter has this quotation. It is the image of ungraceful phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. And that is the first time in the book we hear the word phantom. And after that, in many other parts, especially in parts that talk about Ahab and his psychology, we can see the word phantom again. Now, if I will try to give every single example, the entire presentation will be of that, but I will give a few. For instance, in chapter 47, there is this quote. With a start all glared at dark Ahab, who was surrounded by 5 dusky phantoms that seemed fresh formed out of air. Or in later chapters, in chapter 59, now with the suburbanate phantoms that wander remain soon wound away, for in a veil wanders soon wane. Of course, the word phantom can be used in many different meanings, and then this topic made me curious. When was the term phantom pain coined? I came into conclusion after research that the term was coined by Silas Weir Mitchell, a US Civil War surgeon. Right before it was coined, in 1551, the Ambroise Paré, I think his name is pronounced as, tried to give the explanation of the phantom pain and the missing limb syndrome with this quotation. Verily it is a thing wondrous strange and prodigious, and which will scarce be credited, unless by such as have seen with their eyes, and heard with their ears, the patients who have many months after the cutting away of the leg, grievously complained that they felt exceeding great pain of that leg so cut off. Mostly when we talk about amputation and phantom pain, it is associated as being insane, because people who complain about a pain of a limb that is no longer there can be seen as unstable or is a traumatic response. And who is a character that we see as mad? Captain Ahab. I can think that some of the obsession that Captain Ahab has with his revenge and with his fight against Moby Dick could be analyzed by the topics of phantom pain. Interestingly, when we research more about phantom pain, we can look at the British Medical Journal in the issue that talks about phantom pain, and there is this quotation right at the beginning. After explaining the sensation and what the pain is, the quote goes as, quote, "This sensation has long been general knowledge as shown by the carpenter in Moby Dick, who on hearing Captain Ahab's story stated that a dismasted man never entirely loses the feeling of his old spar, but it will still be pricking him at times." End quote. Now it is interesting that we see in the British Medical Journal, which is one of the most famous, let's say, medical journals in the world, in the right issue talking about phantom pain, we see it being mentioned and related to Captain Ahab. So my question is, could Melville have written Captain Ahab with consideration of phantom pain while creating his character? Because the term was coined before publication of Moby Dick. And then when we look at him, we can see certain symptoms being related to the condition. Here I would like to have some pictures of different dedications of Captain Ahab. And another interesting point to make is that in nowhere in the book we ever learn which leg of his got amputated, which doesn't really have much to do with my presentation, but I still wanted to mention. So the things that I want to mention right now are some of the symptoms that people with phantom pain can feel, and some of the things that can be related to Captain Ahab's habits and how he is presented in the novel. When we first learn about Ahab is that he doesn't leave his cabin often. In the beginning of the journey, Ishmael doesn't see Captain Ahab that much for a long time. This is a very standard and common thing going on with patients who have phantom limb syndrome. Most of the people don't have the energy to leave certain environments, and movements can be difficult. Many people seem to prefer staying inside since outside affects the pain more. Different weather conditions, such as gloomy weather, rainy weathers, can make the pain worse. And Ahab not leaving his cabin could also be related to that. Ahab doesn't speak much, and his first big speech happens at chapter 36, is when he speaks to the other crewmates about how they can capture the whale and how it should be done. We see that he is a man of not many words, and his first big speech is about a lecture. Most people who suffer from phantom limb syndrome tend to be obsessive about this pain, and most other people don't understand the pain, therefore they don't try to talk with others that much. They keep things to themselves, but once in a while they seem to rush off and talk more about things that only they care about. Captain Ahab certainly has this obsession with Moby Dick, and he also has an irritation towards others around him. This can be easily categorized under God syndrome, but perhaps it can also be seen as a physical reaction to a condition that he is suffering from. Ahab's madness is the main point of his character. He is a very complicated character, as everybody might know, but he is mostly described as a madman who seems to value nothing more than his revenge. He doesn't really care about his life or life of others. He doesn't seem to show interest in his marriage or anything else except for the white whale. People with phantom limb syndrome or phantom pain are mostly seen as madmen. They try to make others understand their condition, and they try to make sure that everybody is on the same page as them. However, it is an incredibly difficult condition to explain, and until recent years, there wasn't that many studies about it. So most people who had this syndrome were categorized as mad people and were not understood very well. To make my final point, I would also like to explain why I think that his irritation towards Moby Dick and whales can also be a part of phantom limb syndrome. As far as we know, his leg is made out, the amputated leg that he's standing on, the crouch, is made by a whale bone. It is made by a sperm whale's jaw, just like the same whale type as Moby Dick. So basically, when you have a phantom limb syndrome, the part that hurts is not the part that is left of the leg, but the part that hurts is that you imagine to have a leg there, and it hurts. And Captain Ahab always stands up on the whale bone that is attached to the place where his leg used to be. So basically, he is feeling this pain and irritation in the place where a whale bone is attached. This subconsciously could create a hate towards the bone and the whale kind, as well as remind him of the humiliated fight that he had with the whale. To conclude my presentation, I would like to say that Captain Ahab is a complicated character, and he could be analyzed by many different aspects. In modern days, I think that it is easy to say that, yeah, of course he had that phantom limb syndrome. However, when Moby Dick was written, the syndrome was known, but it was seen as a madman's situation, and most people couldn't really relate to that. And I think that his complicated characterization could be seen as some of the medical conditions' side effects.